Chapter 1. Chapter text. Gerald wasn't used to this. He was a farmhand on Lord Umber's lands. He'd worked the fields his whole life, as had his father, and his father before him. Gerald was a little taller than most and slim besides, with not much to offer the north. Yet when Robb Stark called the banners, a spear was thrust into his hands and he was told he had to fight. Only yesterday had been his 24th name-a-day. Today he was expected to stand in his lord's colours in a lord's hall, drink free ale, and pretend he belonged among real fighting men. Truth be told, Gerald had always wanted to see a feast. He'd never been invited to one. His job was simple: bring in the crops before winter hit and try not to freeze to death in the meantime. Lord Umber never spared him a thought, nor anyone else he knew. Why would he? Umber rubbed shoulders with the Starks. Gerald and his kin shoveled shit, worked the fields, and scraped by on a meager wage. Gerald was a peasant, of a wholly different class. The lords might as well have lived in another world, one where men like him weren't even meant to be seen. And yet here he was, under the shadow of the twins, close enough to hear the music pounding through the stone. A soft breeze pressed against him, carrying the sound of men laughing and drinking. He looked around and noticed something peculiar. Riverlords and rivermen were drinking, laughing, and having a good time. Starks and Stark men such as himself took their toasts outside the keep. Laughter filled the yard. But when he looked at the free men, he had to search hard to see one with a cup in hand. Even Gerald had had a couple of mugs of ale before he noticed it. A few Freys drank here and there, but most of them were stone sober and tight-faced, with only the occasional soft joke between them. Nothing about them said feast. Gerald tried to shake the thought, took a long swig of ale, and pushed ahead. "Gerald! Get your beady-eyed self over here and help me with this barrel," a man shouted. Mickon was another spearman, a few years younger than Gerald. 21 name-a-days had passed him. He was still shaking off the last of his awkward youth. Mickon had worked the fields with Gerald, and though he was boastful, he'd always seemed a solid sort. He'd fought beside Gerald with a spear in hand against Jaime Lannister's host at Oxcross. He was shorter than Gerald, with black hair and brown eyes much like Gerald's own. Where Gerald was lean, with a short stubble that never seemed to grow into a proper beard, Mickon was already sprouting a thick one. His face was rounder, his frame sturdier and solid, broad-shouldered man built for shoving barrels and bracing a shield in a shield wall. Gerald helped Mickon carry the barrel. They set it down, knocked the cork out, and men were already crowding in with cups. Rivermen, Stark men, all laughing. A Free came over to fill his own, the only one Gerald had seen drink all night. As the man tipped his cup, his sleeve slid back. Torchlight caught a band of steel around his wrist, half hidden under the cloth. Why in the blue hells would he be wearing chainmail? Gerald stared. You did not wear armor to a feast unless you thought you might need it. His stomach dropped. Mickon was already walking away, laughing, ale slopping over the rim of his cup. Gerald grabbed him by the arm and yanked him back around. You need to leave, he whispered. Now. Grab as many rivermen and Stark men as you can and get out of here. What in bloody hell are you talking about? Mickon pulled his arm back, face scrunched in confusion. Just go, Gerald said. He kept his voice low and tried not to look at any of the Freys. Then he crossed back to the barrel, snatched up a spear that had been leaning against it, and started toward the keep. Gerald tried to relax, and act like he was part of the feast. Just a man that was carrying his weapon with him to not lose it. Yet, his intentions were entirely different. Something was going down today and Robb Stark gave people that he cared about something they haven't had in a long time. Hope. He was going to see him leave. Gerald still hoped to himself that it was all just a conspiracy formulated in his head. That none of what he was thinking about would come to happen. At the end he was hoping that Robb would look at him and laugh, and he would essentially be the Lord's laughingstock. That was what he hoped for at least. Entering the hall he could hear the wooden doors creak as he slipped by in, noticed two guards guarding the doorway. They gave him a small glance but paid no mind to him. Gerald started to think perhaps it was because he was a peasant. What danger could he possibly be? As he approached the king's table, that was when the world changed. Crossbow bolts screamed across the hall and punched into Stark men. Gerald acted on instinct. He grabbed the edge of the table and heaved, flipping it over just as more bolts thudded into the wood. An older man with hair cut so short he was near bald, the flayed man of Bolton on his chest, was already moving toward Robb Stark. In his hand, half hidden by the chaos, Gerald saw the flash of a dagger. The man wasn't looking at the Freys or the guards. His eyes were fixed on Robb. Gerald threw himself at the king, knocking him to the ground as another volley of bolts slammed into the upturned table. He rolled, saw the Bolton man looming over them, dagger coming down, and did the only thing he could think of. He drove his fist up as hard as he could into the man's jaw. Bone crunched. The Bolton staggered, eyes rolling, and toppled backwards out of sight. Lucky punch, Gerald thought wildly. We need to go, ye Grace, he shouted, grabbing Robb by the collar and dragging him toward the doors. Shouts and screams filled the hall. Men dropped left and right, cut down by bolts and knives. Above it all, the musicians soared out the same cold, thin tune. The Rains of Castamaria. The two guards from the doorway rushed at them. Gerald snatched up his spear, braced, and hurled it. The point took the first man in the face under his helm and dropped him where he stood. The second came on with a roar. Gerald heard Robb's answering scream of rage at his side and flinched as the king's sword hacked the man down. Talisa! Robb screamed, looking back at his wife, now laid out on the floor, eyes closed, covered in her own blood. He barely had time to move before Gerald grabbed him and dragged him toward the door. We need to go, ye Grace, now. Robb had tears streaming down his face. He moved on instinct. Another Free rushed them and Robb swung, his sword biting into the man's neck. The Free dropped, blood spraying across the rushes. Gerald snatched up another spear, drove it into the throat of a second Free who charged them. My wife, my child, Robb said, still in disbelief. Sire, don't grieve them now, Gerald snapped. They'd want you living. Grieve them when we're out of this shithole. They rounded a corner and saw two Freys hacking at a lone riverman, the man already stumbling under their blows. Their backs were turned. Robb buried his sword in one man's back. Gerald thrust his spear clean through the other, dropping them both. He looked at the bewildered riverman. Follow and protect your king. Gerald barked. For the first time in his life he was giving orders to the sort of man who usually shouted at him and dumped the worst work on his head. Any other day Gerald might have laughed at the thought, and the swordsman might have beaten him bloody for it. Now, with bodies all around and the hall screaming, the man just nodded, tightened his grip on his sword, and moved to Robb's flank. Stark and Riverman were dying all around. It wasn't a battle but a slaughter. Some of the lucky Stark and Riverman were able to grab their swords and weapons and at least make a fight of it, many of them were cut down anyways. The three men met up with a Stark swordsman, holding a sword clearly blooded however wasn't facing anyone at the moment. He instantly joined the group. What in the seven hells is going on? A man screamed, he was down to just his brown wool pants, was wearing no shirt. A Bolton man approached him and the shirtless man cut him down with ease, showing years of training. Edmure, they are trying to kill us. Let's get out of here. Robb shouted. Edmure just nodded and waved his arm as a pretty girl followed him. A few more stragglers joined up, all surrounding Robb and Edmure trying to protect them. Gerald was desperately trying to rally anyone he saw that was a Stark or Riverman to join them, at the same token held onto his spear so tight that his hands hurt. He looked ahead. They are blocking the way out. Gerald screamed, stating the obvious, as about 10 Freys were guarding the gates at the south tower. Then cut them down. Robb ordered. The straggling men just nodded and engaged the Freys, as did Gerald. He held the spear and quickly stabbed a man in the chest with all he could muster, the spear going through the man's mail into his chest. Withdrawing it, he stabbed another man that went to stab Robb from behind, a third Free tackled into him against the wall, pressing his spear down and closing the distance rendering it useless. Lifting up a short sword the man was going to stab him. Gerald knew he had to do something else he would be disemboweled on this forsaken ground. With all of his might he grabbed his arm and held the sword down to the Frey side then bit the man in the cheek as hard as he can tearing the flesh from his face. The man let out a blood-curdling scream that sent shivers down to his spine, dropping the sword. In a quick moment Gerald picked up the sword and rammed it through his neck. Going back down, he picked back up his spear and looked around. The Frys guarding the door was dead, a few of the Starks and Rivermen dead. Robb, Edmure, Gerald and the motley crew assembled in haste ran out of the keep. Outside the twins was no better than inside. Out here the hosts of men were fighting, but the Starks and Rivermen were badly outnumbered and out-equipped. A few put up a valiant fight, but it was clear this wasn't a battle. If it ever had been, it was long since lost. Gerald ran at the front of their little knot, a farmhand with a spear in his hands sprinting through a field of dead and dying. For a heartbeat he slowed. At his feet lay a familiar face. "Mikken," Gerald said aloud. "He's lost." "We need to move," Edmure answered. Robb, trying to grieve while fighting through the madness, had gone quiet. So far he'd let Edmure take charge of getting them out. "He was my friend," Gerald said. "Everyone lost someone dear to them today. Remember him, but move on. We will get our vengeance," Robb snapped back, his voice enough to jolt Gerald out of his frozen stare. Gerald nodded and forced his legs to keep moving. Ahead he saw an older man with a great sword cleaving through Frys. Blades had already found him, Gerald could see the blood soaking his mail. He was going to die here in the field, but the look on his face said plain he'd die with a sword in his hand. "Lord Forrester!" Robb shouted, charging the Frys swarming the old man. He and a few Stark swordsmen cut them down. Gregor let out a long breath. "I'm done for, Your Grace," he said, looking up at Robb, barely holding himself upright on his knees. "You served your house and your king with honor," Gregor, Robb replied, standing over him. "If you will, Your Grace, get my squire out. He's served me well. He'll need another knight to squire for." Gregor's voice shook, but his eyes were steady. "I promise," Robb said. He had known Gregor since he was a boy, one of the few small houses sworn directly to Stark, not through a greater lord. "Go, then, Your Grace. I'll buy you time," Gregor said. He pushed himself back to his feet and met another Frey, sword swinging, as Robb Stark, Edmure Tully, Gerald and the rest of the stragglers broke away. "We get through these trees here and follow the riverbank," Edmure called a little later, breathless but thinking. "It'll take us straight to Riverrun." Robb agreed at once. Gerald was shaking and felt sick. He tried not to vomit in the grass and failed, dropping to a knee and retching. "What is your name, sir?" Robb asked him when he was done. Gerald wiped his mouth and looked up. "Gerald, Your Grace." "Gerald," Robb said, meeting his eyes. "The king is in your debt, but I've one more favor to ask of you." Gerald still felt numb. "What is it?" "Come with us to Riverrun," Robb said. "Help me see that the bastards who did this meet the end they deserve." Something in that snapped him back together. Gerald straightened, fingers tightening around his spear. "Of course," he said. The screams behind them grew softer as they pushed on. For the moment, they were safe. As the hours passed, more men stumbled out of the dark to join them, Stark men, Rivermen, all with the same hollow look. Most of them had been running for their lives with one thought in mind: get to the nearest friendly holdfast. For the Rivermen, that meant one place above all. Riverrun, they were saying to each other when they first saw Gerald's band by the riverbank. "We'll go to Riverrun. Lord Brynden will know what to do now that Stark and Tully are gone." Then someone in the growing grey light recognized a face. Word rippled through the stragglers like fire through dry grass. "That's Edmure. And Stark, Robb Stark's alive." Men who had been walking with their heads down straightened. A few even laughed, sharp and disbelieving, or wiped at their eyes with dirty hands. By the time they set off again along the riverbank, they weren't just a collection of broken survivors running for a war. They were following their lord and their king. By the next night they reached Riverrun. Gerald tried to keep his face steady. He'd never spent time inside Riverrun before, only ever waited outside its walls as a spear Levi, told where to stand and when to march. For the first time in his life he walked through its gates, across its yard, into its stone belly. He only wished it were under better circumstances. A large, older man with a sword at his hip was waiting for them, grey hair, hard eyes, every man around him holding himself a little straighter. Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. His face was like carved stone, but the fury in his eyes was plain. Robb spoke with him only briefly. Then, for the first time since the slaughter began, he turned away from his men, shut himself in a chamber, and did not come out. Word of what Gerald had done at the twins spread fast. He was given bread and salt, a real bed, and the kind of respect usually reserved for minor lords. It sat strangely on his shoulders. Instead of lying down, he followed his king. He knocked on the door. After a moment it opened. Robb stood there, hair a mess, face red and streaked with tears. "Talisa." He choked. "Your Grace," Gerald said softly. He had a wife of his own back on Umberlands, a woman who was his whole world. He could not begin to imagine what Robb had just seen done to his. He wasn't sure what sort of man would come out the other side of that. He shuddered to think what he would have become, if it had been Jonelle. "My wife and my child, they butchered them like cattle." Robb screamed. Gerald couldn't relate to the loss itself, only to the thought of it. He just knew his king needed someone standing there who wasn't a lord or a banner or a duty, just a man. He crossed to the table and poured wine into a cup. "I don't want no bloody drink." Robb snapped at him. Gerald only nodded. "No," he said quietly, "but you need it." Robb stared at him for a long heartbeat, breathing hard. Then he snatched the cup from Gerald's hand and drank it down in great gulps. Chapter 2, Calm in King's Landing. Chapter text. Oliver stood in front of the small warped mirror, tugging the clasp of his gold cloak tight at his shoulder. The heavy cloth settled around him, familiar now, the weight of it a strange kind of comfort. 21, if his parents were still alive, he knew they'd tell him they were proud of him. He stood a little taller than most men in the city, all lean muscle from drills and patrols rather than feasts. Whenever he had an idle hour, he went looking for some new way to better himself, running the steps in the morning, extra time at sparring until his arms ached. The training yard had shown the result. The other cloaks might drink their pay away, Oliver preferred to feel his sword arm grow steadier. He wasn't anything special, not by birth. His family had been poor as rats in Flea Bottom once, packed 3 to a bed with the stink of the alleys coming through the cracks. That changed only when his father found work as a merchant's factor. Coins started to trickle in. Then it became a stream. They moved out of the bottom and into a cleaner, quieter part of the city where the gutters didn't run brown every morning. At 14, Oliver signed on with the Gold Cloaks, to his parents' delight. A steady wage. A uniform. A future. There, he was given a sword and taught how to use it, and learned he loved the feel of steel in his hands, loved the crack of a good parry, the shock of a clean hit. The watch taught him more than that, too. He learned his letters, learned to read the names on warrants and writs. There was no use for a stupid gold cloak, the captains said, and Oliver had taken that to heart. Now, at 21 and entering his prime, he should have felt satisfied. But he couldn't get one thing out of his head. Myra Forrester. The girl from Ironrath in the north. She had the dark hair common enough among northern women, but her eyes, grey, mostly, though sometimes, when the light caught them just so, a green sheen slipped across them like sunlight on deep water. When she smiled, truly smiled, not the careful caught smile but with one small dimple formed in her cheek. Oliver had caught himself staring more than once. He had to admit he'd fallen for her and fallen hard. Myra had come south when Lord Eddard Stark took up the office of Hand, joining Sansa Stark as one of her attendants. After Lord Eddard lost his head on the steps of the Great September, Myra's days in the capital had only grown darker. Oliver had started finding her in the gardens more often then, sitting alone amongst the hedges and fountains, as if trying to breathe air that wasn't soaked in blood and whispers. He'd learned that she went there to get away from the Red Keep, from the court, from all of it. Little by little, they'd begun to talk. First a few words about the weather, then about the north, then about the things no one else would listen to. She would confide in him sometimes, voice soft, eyes turned toward some point far beyond the walls. Oliver had no illusions. He was almost certain she didn't look at him as anything more than a trusted friend, a guard with a kind face and a willing ear. But for him, he was tortured by her. Every time they were apart his chest ached, his thoughts circling back to her no matter how he tried to push them away. When she was near, any anger he carried, at the city, at his lot, at himself, seemed to wither to nothing. He felt truly happy, perhaps for the first time in his life, when Myra Forrester was within arm's reach. Oliver tore his gaze away from the mirror, glanced around the cramped room, and took up his standard-issue sword. He slid it into its sheath at his hip and headed out to start his rounds. It had taken some quiet conniving with his superiors and a few fellow gold cloaks, but he'd managed to shape his patrols so they always, somehow, passed near the places Myra favored. Even a few moments in the gardens, catching sight of her from a distance, were worth the trouble. First, he made his usual way down toward Flea Bottom. He spoke with the locals and the small-time merchants, listening for trouble, who'd been robbed, who was cheating whom, who was about to start something ugly. Where there was a crime, he tried to find a fix. Sometimes that meant a sharp word and a warning. Sometimes it meant an arrest. Twice, it had meant steel. The first time a man drew a sword on him in an alley, Oliver realized in an instant that sparring in the yard and fighting for his life were not the same thing at all. The world narrowed to the flash of a blade and the pound of his own heartbeat. He hated that feeling, the cold knowledge that one misstep meant he died in the dirt. Both times, though, he walked away without a scratch. The men who'd raised steel at a gold cloak had not. "Hey, Lysa. How's it going today?" Oliver called as he turned onto a crooked side street. Lysa was a whore, one he'd never paid for but spoke with often. She joked with him when the mood took her, and other times she passed him tidbits of gossip that turned out to be worth more than most confessions. A lot of gold cloaks never learned the lesson he had. Their work was to stop and solve crimes, and the whores were the gatekeepers of information. It always paid to have one or two you were on good terms with. He couldn't quite remember whether he'd chosen Lysa or Lysa had chosen him. It didn't really matter. In a city full of liars and strangers, she had become his confidant. "Slow day, Ollie. You mind giving me a tumble?" Lysa teased. Oliver let out a small laugh. "I'm afraid I can't afford you on my wages, Lysa." Nice try, though. Ollie was a nickname she'd given him a long time ago, and it had stuck in a way he'd never quite managed to shake. "Yeah, I'd believe you all right," Lysa shot back, "if your buddies didn't come knocking on my door every day." "A fool's stag is a lost stag," Oliver said. "Better you have it than some of the lot I share the cloak with." Lysa laughed, shaking her head. "I got nothing for you today, Ollie. Check back tomorrow." He nodded and moved on. His next stop was the docks, where the air was thick with salt, tar, and shouted bargains. He spoke with a few merchants there, listening for trouble as always. By this time of day, habit usually led him to buy a bit of cooked fish from a dockside stall before heading back up toward the Red Keep. As he ate his fish, Oliver heard a commotion. A gold cloak by the name of Demon had a small boy by the arm. Demon wasn't like most of the watch. Some of the cloaks Oliver served with he could tolerate, a few were even decent folk trying to do right in a rotten city. Demon, though, belonged in an entirely different circle of the seven hells. He loved pain. Loved to watch it, loved to cause it. When word had reached the barracks that Samarin Trant of the Kingsguard had beaten Sansa Stark on Joffrey's orders, Demon's eyes had lit up the way a child's might at the sight of a sweet. Something in him was broken, and it was broken to the core. "You like stealing, eh?" Demon roared now. Every merchant on the dock turned to stare. The boy was crying, thin arm twisted in Demon's grip. He couldn't be more than 8 days old. Oliver could see the white of Demon's knuckles, he was squeezing as hard as he could. Demon slammed the child's hand down on a nearby stall table and yanked a dagger from his belt. "This'll teach you to keep your grubby hands to yourself," he shouted. A few merchants began shouting back, telling him to let the boy go. The child was clearly half-starved, little more than bones and rags. Likely an orphan. All he'd taken was a single cooked fillet of fish, enough to quiet the worst of the hunger for one night. And for that, Demon meant to take his hand. He shoved the merchants away when they got too close. They knew better than to press a gold cloak too hard. Oliver watched the dagger flash in the sun and felt his stomach turn. He couldn't let this stand. He pushed back from his table, leaving his half-eaten fish where it lay, and crossed the distance in a few long strides. "Demon." "Let him go," Oliver said, voice low but firm. "No." Demon didn't even look at him. This little bastard's going to learn what it feels like to have his hand sawed off. It'll teach him not to steal from his betters. That was enough. Oliver caught Demon by the shoulder and shoved him hard. The other man went down on his back, armor clanging against the stone. The dagger skittered away. Oliver turned to the boy. "Run," he snapped. The child didn't wait to be told twice. He snatched his hand back and bolted into the press of the crowd, gone in a heartbeat. Demon scraped himself off the ground, face red, eyes wild. "I should kill you, you dumb bastard," he spat, stepping in until he was inches from Oliver. "We both know you couldn't best me with blades even on your best day and my worst," Oliver said quietly. "If you really want to try, I won't stop you." For a moment the docs held their breath. The threat hung between them, as sharp as any drawn sword. Then the truth of it sank into Demon's drink-soured brain. His gaze flicked to Oliver's hand resting on the hilt of his sword, then to the ring of watching faces. He muttered something foul under his breath, turned on his heel, and stalked off. Oliver let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The half-eaten fish on his table had gone cold, but his appetite was gone anyways. Oliver could tell by the slant of the sun that it was nearly the hour Myra usually took her walk in the gardens. He hurried along the dock, tossing the half-eaten fish back into the water for the shadows that circled beneath the surface. Demon had soured his mood, left a bitter taste in his mouth that no food could wash away. But the closer he came to the Red Keep and its gardens, the more that anger withered. By the time he passed through the archway of carved stone into the greenness beyond, the worst of it had left. He saw her at once. Myra sat alone on a bench beneath a flowering tree, skirts gathered neatly, hands still in her lap. When she turned at the sound of his boots on the gravel, his heart seemed to drop straight into his stomach. Worry was written plain across her face. A single tear traced a line down her cheek. "My lady, how has your day been?" Oliver asked gently. "I fear my time here may be running short," Myra said. Her voice was soft, but the fear in it was sharp enough for him to hear. "In what way, my lady?" he asked, hoping it was something he could dismiss with a few steady words. "They found some correspondence I sent to my father." "To Gregor?" She swallowed, eyes fixed on her hands. "I didn't mean anything by it. I didn't write anything treasonous. I just miss him." Oliver could see the problem as clearly as if it had been inked on parchment. A handmaiden of House Stark, sending unapproved letters out of the city, while the crown was at war with the North and the Riverlords. It didn't matter what she'd written. The fact that she'd written at all would be enough for some. He reached out and took her hand. It was a bold thing to do, bolder than he'd ever dared before, but he couldn't stand to see her shaking and do nothing. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "Any way I can help you?" The question was honest. His heart was breaking for her, and he had no idea how to mend anything. "If you hear anything, please tell me," she said softly. "Anything about me? About what they mean to do?" "Of course, my lady. I promise," Oliver swore. And he meant it. If there was danger, he would see it coming for her if he could. Myra rose to her feet and looked down at him, his hand slipping from hers as she moved away. "Thank you, Oliver," she said. "For always being there with me as a dear friend." The words stung more than he wanted to admit. He knew it was foolish to hope for anything else, but knowing didn't dull the ache. Of course he managed. "I'll always be there, if you need me." Myra walked off, and Oliver's heart felt like it had been scattered in pieces across the garden path. He sat there a moment longer after she was gone, staring at the place she'd just been, then forced himself to his feet. There was nothing more he could do for her today. He called it a day earlier than usual and made his way to the tavern near his quarters. The common room was thick with smoke and noise, men singing half-remembered songs, others trading jests and boasts over their cups. Oliver took a stool in the corner, cloak still wrapped around his shoulders. He didn't even bother to take it off. When people saw the gold, they tended to leave him alone, and that suited him fine. He wanted no company tonight, just his Waterdale and his thoughts. He kept his eyes and ears open out of habit, listening to the flow of talk, rumors of battles far away, grumbles about prices, a filthy joke about a scepter and a sellsword, but none of it touched him. He drank, slowly, one cup and then another, more for the dull warmth than any true enjoyment. After a few ales, he slid a couple of coins across the bar to the keeper and stepped back out into the night. The moon was high, its pale light silvering the rooftops and the narrow street as he walked toward his door. The city felt smaller at this hour, the usual clamor reduced to distant echoes. He had just reached for the latch when a door farther down the corridor opened. The sound of boots and rattling metal made his heart drop into the pit of his stomach. 2 guards came into view, each with a hand on the chain that ran between the iron cuffs on their prisoners' wrists. Myra. Her hands were bound in front of her, chains clinking softly with each step. Her eyes were red, her face pale, but she held herself as straight as the bonds allowed. Oliver forced his shoulders to stay loose, his face blank. Any flicker of recognition or panic would damn them both. "New prisoner?" he asked, keeping his tone light, almost bored, as if he'd only spoken to fill the silence. "I," one of the men grunted. He glanced at Myra with something like contempt before adding, louder, "Charged with treason. She'll see a noose in the morning." The words hit Oliver harder than any blow. He managed a non-committal sound and stepped aside to let them pass, but inside his thoughts were already racing, his promise in the garden echoing in his mind. "If you hear anything, please tell me." Morning suddenly felt far too close. Chapter 3, The Escape. Chapter text. Oliver could still hear the words long after the guards had dragged Myra past him. "Charged with treason. She'll see the noose in the morning." They rang in his skull like a bell, muffled and mean under the fog of ale. "I love her," he muttered, so quietly even he barely heard it. It was the first time he'd ever said it out loud. He wished, not for the first time, that it was only infatuation. A passing thing. She was a noble woman. He was a boy from Flea Bottom who'd traded rags for a cloak and a sword. There was never going to be a place for him at her side. He knew that. He'd always known that. And yet he thought of her constantly. Counted his days by the times he'd see her in the gardens, or in passing behind Sansa Stark. Tomorrow that would all end. The thought sat in his gut like a stone, making him feel sick. He pushed his way into his quarters, the door creaking on tired hinges, and started digging through the small chest at the foot of his bed. Shirts, a spare pair of boots, a threadbare cloak, then his fingers closed on what he was looking for, a plain black hood and cloak. Something he could hide her with. He shook it out, bundled it as tight as he could manage, and shoved the cloth under his breastplate where it wouldn't flap or tangle his arms. Close enough to grab in a heartbeat, out of the way until he could throw it around Myra's shoulders. His sword leaned where he'd left it by the bed before he went drinking. He picked it up, the familiar weight a small comfort, and slid it back into its scabbard at his hip. For a moment he stood there in the dim room, listening to his own breathing. Noose in the morning. He pulled his cloak tight and stepped back into the corridor. Am I really going to do this? He was going to have to truly fight and kill people he knew. Not cut purses in Flea Bottom, not some nameless thug in an alley, men he'd drunk with, sparred with, complained about captains with. The thought made fear spike through his chest, sharp enough to cut through a little of the ale. The corridor swayed as he stepped into it. When he turned his head too fast, the world dragged behind his gaze for a heartbeat before snapping back into place. That was why he never drank before a shift. A man who saw 2 blades when there was only one usually ended up on the wrong end of both. He couldn't wait to sober up. By the time his hands stopped shaking, Myra would be swinging from a rope. So he walked. Gold cloaks, men-at-arms, squires, servants, they all moved past him in a blur of faces and cloaks. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on not letting the hitch in his step turn into a stagger. As far as anyone could see, he was just another guard on some errand. Oliver. I didn't realize you'd been demoted to night shift. Serves your dumb ass right. Demon's voice cut across the hall. He was a smear of gold and steel at the edge of Oliver's vision until Oliver forced his gaze to settle and the world snapped into a single demon leaning on a doorframe. I don't have the patience to deal with your shit today, Demon Oliver said. Even to his own ears, his tongue felt a fraction slow. Drop it. What was that lady you seemed sweet on? Demon went on, like he hadn't spoken. Don't think I haven't noticed you always sniffing around her every chance you get. Oliver stopped. The motion made the floor lurch, he had to set his feet wider to keep from swaying. His hand had already found the hilt at his hip. I'm warning you, Demon. Drop it. Demon's grin sharpened. He could smell the ale on Oliver now and it clearly pleased him. I heard she's to be hanged tomorrow, he said. Guess that's what she gets for befriending a gutter rat like you. Shame you never got to fuck her. Oliver's jaw clenched. The corridor narrowed down to Demon's face and the door behind him. His heart was pounding too loud. His fingers dug into the leather of his grip until his knuckles hurt. Demon saw the silence and mistook it for weakness. Think I may have to visit her when I'm relieved, he went on. Headsman won't mind if I give her a tumble or two first. Let her feel what it's like when a real man forces himself inside her. The words blurred into noise. Oliver didn't remember deciding to move. One breath Demon was talking, the next his own sword was in his hand and the weight of it dragged at his wrist as he swung. The world smeared sideways with the motion. For a heartbeat there were two demons, two sneering mouths, two exposed throats. He aimed for the middle. Steel bit into flesh just above the gorget where the man's armor gaped. It wasn't the clean thrust he would have made sober and more of a brutal, hacking cut, but it was enough. Hot spray hit his cheek. Demon's eyes went round. He grabbed for his own sword, fingers slipping on the hilt. Oliver wrenched his blade free and, half on instinct, slammed his shoulder into Demon's chest. The bigger man crashed back against the door, then slid down it, leaving a red smear behind. His hands scrabbled uselessly at the wound in his neck, blood pouring between his fingers in a steady, horrible rush. He tried to speak. Nothing came but a wet choke. The light bled out of his eyes. The hallway was suddenly very quiet. Oliver stood there, sword dripping, breathing hard. His head was ringing, and the stone under his boots still felt like it wanted to tilt sideways. There was no going back now. He grabbed the handle and pushed the door open. To his surprise, a young woman stood in the middle of the room, red hair spilling loose over her shoulders, her face drawn tight with worry. Sansa Stark. Inwardly, Oliver groaned. Leaving her would be simpler and safer, but he knew he'd regret it for the rest of his life. If you ever want to see your family again, come with me, Oliver said. The words came out a little thick, but clear enough. Sansa's eyes flicked from his face to the corpse in the corridor, then back again. She didn't know how much longer she could endure Joffrey's cruelty. Lately it had begun to feel less like life and more like waiting for an executioner she hadn't been told about. Maybe they would kill her. Maybe they wouldn't. She only knew she couldn't stay here any longer. She nodded. Grab a cloak, Oliver told her. Something to hide your face. Sansa moved quickly, crossing to her chest of drawers. She pulled out a dark cloak and threw it on over her nightgown, fingers fumbling only once at the ties before she pulled the hood up to shadow her hair. Sansa quickly went to her drawers and found the garb she was looking for, a dark cloak that fell to her ankles. She pulled it on over her nightgown and raised the hood, hiding most of her hair. Good, Oliver said. One more thing. He stepped back into the corridor, grabbed Demon under the arms and dragged him inside the room, boots scraping on stone. Sansa flinched as the dead weight slid past her, leaving a smeared trail of blood across the floor. Help me with the door, he muttered. She shut it as he hauled the body behind the bed, out of immediate sight to anyone just glancing in. It wasn't perfect, but it would buy them a little time before someone noticed their missing guard. Oliver blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, and opened the door again to peer into the hall. Empty, for now. Keep your hood up, he told her quietly. Head down. Walk like you belong here and don't speak unless I tell you. Sansa nodded once. They stepped out together. The corridor felt longer than it ever had before. A pair of servants hurried past them carrying a basket of linens. A Lannister man at arms trudged by, yawning, too tired to spare them more than a glance. Oliver kept his stride even, forcing his legs to move at a steady pace, forcing the world to catch up every time it threatened to drag behind his eyes. Every turn of the stairwell took them lower. The air grew colder, damper, and the smell changed from smoke and perfume to stone, mold, and old fear. At the top of the last flight that led down into the dungeons proper, Oliver stopped. "This is as far as you go," he said, turning to Sansa. "Wait here by the landing. If anyone asks, you're a servant sent to fetch a prisoner for questioning. If it's me, you'll know. If it's not..." He shrugged. "Keep your head down and say you were given the wrong level." Her fingers tightened on the edge of her cloak. "You are coming back," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I didn't come this far to leave you standing in a stairwell," Oliver replied. "I'm getting her, and then I'm getting both of you out. That's the plan." He didn't give her time to answer. If he did, he might start thinking too much. She kept it to herself, but it was clear who he was talking about. Oliver turned and started down the last set of steps, each one echoing under his boots. The torches burned lower here, the shadows longer. Somewhere ahead, he could already hear voices, the lazy laughter of men who thought no one would disturb them before morning. "She's a pretty one, ain't she?" a voice carried along the damp stone, warped by the tunnel. "She's going to die tomorrow, be hanged." "I bet the Queen wouldn't care if we had our turn with her first," another voice answered, closer this time. The words bounced off the walls, coming at him from odd angles. Oliver kept moving toward the sound, boots scraping on the steps. "A minor noble lady. I wonder if she's ever been with a man yet." The question made the ale in Oliver's stomach roil. For a moment he thought he might actually be sick there in the stairwell. "I always wanted to fuck a noble lady in the ass." "You hold her down first, then I'll do it for you." "Why do you get to go first?" the other complained. He could hear the rattling of keys. "Because I'll get her ass first, then you get her virginity," the man justified. Oliver heard the door swing open. Drunkenly he came to a small jog until he saw the open door. He could hear Myra screaming now. His sword was already in his hand. He'd made the decision on the stairs. He wasn't giving them time to talk, bargain, or even understand. He was going to kill them. One man had his hands locked around Myra's wrists, forcing her face down against the cold stone as she pleaded with them to stop. The other was at her waist, fumbling with her gun, half undressed and almost free to take what he wanted. Oliver never gave him the chance. He crossed the last few steps in a lurching rush and drove his sword into the back of the man's neck. The point punched out through the front of his throat in a burst of blood that sprayed across the floor and spattered Myra's skin. She screamed as the body sagged on top of her, dead weight pinning her down. The man holding her wrists let go with a curse, stumbling back and snatching at the sword on his hip. Oliver could feel the world lag for a heartbeat, the torchlight smearing as the man's arm moved. He waited that fraction of a moment for his vision to catch up, there, and when it cleared, the man was in front of him with steel in his hand. Myra gathered herself and scrambled into the far corner, curling up against the wall. She watched with wide eyes. For once, Oliver was glad she'd moved. Last thing he wanted was her getting hit by a stray blade while he was fighting this animal. The man swung first. Oliver saw the steel coming a heartbeat too late. The lag was still there, the world dragging just behind his eyes, but he managed to bring his own sword up in time. Their blades met with a jarring clang that rattled his arms to the shoulder. He found himself clinging to the basics harder than he ever had. Guard up, feet under him, keep the point between them. He'd never fought like this with drink in his blood, and he prayed to every god he knew that this would be the last time. First, though, he had to live through it. The dungeon guard pulled back and came again, a downward cut from his high left to low right. Oliver's vision smeared, then snapped back as he stepped into the line of the blow and smashed his sword up to meet it. Sparks spat. It bought him another breath, nothing more. His mind was half a step behind his hands. He couldn't keep trading like this or they'd both be dead, him and Myra. He needed to change it. For his first real attack, he stepped in close instead of away and drove his forehead forward with everything he had. His helm crunched into bare flesh. The guard's nose gave with a wet crack. The man went down hard on his back, blood streaming over his face. He still tried to swing, dragging his sword up in a wild arc from the floor as he struggled to rise. Oliver didn't give him the chance. He chopped down, edge first, at the man's wrist. Steel bit through flesh and bone. The hand came off in a spray of red, the sword clattering away across the stones. The guard's blood-curdling scream echoed throughout the halls. Oliver cut it off by driving his blade straight into the man's chest, pushing until he felt the point grind against stone beneath. The body jerked once, then went still. He wiped his blade on the dead man's cloak, then shoved it back into its sheath. When he turned, Myra was pressed into the corner, eyes huge, chains hanging slack now that her wrists were free. Oliver held out his hand. For a moment she just stared at it. He'd always been polite with her, friendly in stolen moments in the gardens, but after what she'd just seen, two dead men on the floor, blood everywhere, and she had no idea what to make of him. For all she knew, he could have been some agent of the Keep gone mad. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. "We need to go," he said. The words slurred together a little. Myra's brow creased. "You're drunk," she said. "Not accusing, it's just stating a fact." Oliver replied, a humorless huff escaping him. "Becoming a traitor wasn't something I ever saw myself doing. But I couldn't leave you to die." He met her gaze, steady despite the ale in his blood. "So here I am." Myra's response was simple, and it caught Oliver off guard. She stepped forward and hugged him, clinging to him tightly as a small, broken sob escaped her. He froze for half a heartbeat, then wrapped one arm around her shoulders, careful of the blood on his mail. When she finally pulled back, he tugged the bundled cloak from under his breastplate and pressed it into her hands. "Put this on," he said. "Hood up." She obeyed, fingers still shaking. "Come now," Oliver coaxed gently. "We need to leave. I have someone I want you to meet." Myra gathered herself and followed him out of the dungeon. At the top of the stair a hooded figure stood waiting, back against the wall. "Myra!" Sangza exclaimed, almost too loud. The word echoed off stone and Oliver's heart lurched. The two women rushed together and embraced, clinging to one another. "We have to stay quiet," Oliver hissed. "Hoods up. Don't speak to anyone. Once we're out of King's Landing, then you can talk as much as you like." They fell in behind him. King's Landing was vast, and even keeping to the quieter streets and alleys, it took them near 2 hours to wind their way down from the Red Keep toward the outer gates. By then Oliver could feel the ale burning off. His vision no longer lagged when he turned his head. The dull fog was still there, but he knew if it came to a fight now, he'd be twice the man he'd been in the dungeons. "Halt!" a city guard barked as they approached the gate. He stepped forward, spear lowered across their path. Oliver stopped. Myra and Sangza did the same behind him. "State your business," the guard demanded. "I'm escorting these two to serve as handmaidens for Lady Rosby," Oliver said without missing a beat. Behind him, the women kept their heads bowed, faces shadowed. The guard squinted past him, trying to get a better look. "Rosby, is it? Funny, I wasn't told." He leaned to the side, peering at Sangza. "Wait a minute. Lift your head." Sangza flinched as his hand reached toward her hood. "Wait," he said, realization dawning. "You're..." He never finished the sentence. Oliver stepped in and drove his sword up into the man's throat. The guard collapsed with a wet gurgle, spear clattering on the stones. Oliver grabbed him under the arm and dragged him aside just enough to clear the way. He glanced back. The street behind them was empty. Most honest folk were abed at this hour, and the watch was thin this far from the Red Keep. "We need to go now," he snapped. They ran through the gate and out into the dark, open ground beyond the walls. For several long minutes Oliver kept them moving at a hard pace, waiting for shouts, for the clang of an alarm bell, for the pounding of boots behind them. None came. Only when he was sure no one was following did he slow. Myra was panting, Sangza pale beneath her hood, but both were keeping up. "Where are we heading?" Myra asked between breaths. He could feel Sangza's attention sharpen at the question. "Riverrun," Oliver said. Chapter 4, Regrouping at Riverrun. Chapter text. Robb Stark groaned, his head was pounding, the memories of the past few days were still weighing him down. He remembered Talisa's beautiful smile, her olive skin, her dark eyes and hair. He would never again raise from bed to see them again. He missed her dearly, the love he had for her felt like it was shattered, just leaving an empty hole from where it was. He didn't want justice, he didn't want vengeance, he wanted revenge. Robb couldn't imagine feeling any other way. Those traitors not only tried to kill him and topple his family line, they killed his wife and his child. He vowed to himself that every house involved, their whole family will be ripped out of their castle's root and stem. No one involved will be allowed to call themselves a lord or lady ever again. Rob rolled over, swung his feet off the bed, and slowly dressed himself, tugging on his boots with stiff fingers. His head still pounded, and Talisa's face kept drifting to the front of his mind no matter how he tried to shove it down. He missed her smile, her soft laugh, the warmth of her hand on his chest when he woke. They had taken that from him. His wife. His child. His future. He didn't want justice. He didn't want some pretty word like vengeance. He wanted revenge. Every house that had had a hand in the Red Wedding would pay for it. Root and stem, he vowed, none who'd raised their banners for free and Bolton would be left to call themselves lord or lady when he was done. But revenge would take time. Today he needed to meet with his lords, plan their next moves, and start putting those vows into action. Once dressed, he stepped out into the chill air and walked down to the yard. Brynden Tully and his nephew, Lord Edmure Tully, were there, speaking with their men. They'd been splitting their time checking on the stragglers that still limped in from the twins, making sure the wounded and scattered had food and a place to lay their heads. Edmure had taken back his place as Lord of Riverrun with a quiet, dogged determination. He was a caring man, always had been. He cared for those close to him and for his people as if they were family. It was what made him only a decent commander and never a great one. But to the small folk of the Trident, he was a wonderful lord, and they loved him for it. Rob's gaze drifted past them and found Gerald. The young man was just standing near the edge of the yard, watching knights drill with blunted steel, looking lost and out of place. A Levi with nothing to do. A nobody again, in his own eyes. Something has to be done with him, Rob thought. What he did for me, there's no repaying that. But I can start. Gerald. Rob called. The shout caught him off guard. Gerald jerked, half jogging over as if afraid he'd already done something wrong. Your Grace, he asked, breath puffing in the cold. Kneel, Rob said. The word cracked across the yard. Edmure and Brynden both turned at the tone, conversation dying on their lips. A few of the men nearby stopped their drills to look over. Your Grace. Gerald repeated, confused. I said kneel, Rob snapped, sharper this time. Gerald dropped to one knee so fast he almost lost his balance, head bowed. Rob drew his sword. Steel hissed against leather, and the quiet in the yard deepened. He stepped forward until the shadows of Brynden and Edmure fell in beside his own. At the twins he went on, when guest right was broken and our hosts turned their crossbows on their guests, you stood your ground. When others froze or fled, you overturned a table into the storm of bolts and dragged your king out from under it. You bled for me when your king was surrounded by traitorous cunts. Rob spat. In the name of the old gods, Rob said, voice carrying, and before the eyes of men, I charge you to be brave, to be just, to defend the innocent and protect women and children. To respect the laws of the North and the Trident, to honor your king, and to keep these vows with diligence until your death. He rested the flat of his blade on top of Gerald's dark head. The young man was shaking, more from shock than fear. Do you accept these charges, Gerald? Rob asked. I do, Your Grace, Gerald managed. Rob shifted the blade, touching it lightly to one shoulder, then the other. He lifted the sword. Then rise as Sir Gerald, Rob declared, his voice ringing off the stone, a knight of the North and the Trident. For a heartbeat, Gerald didn't move. Then he pushed himself to his feet, eyes wide, looking as if the world had shifted under him. Around them, men cheered, Rivermen most loudly, with the few Northmen who'd made it out of the slaughter adding their rough shouts. A couple of young knights with good names watched with tight jaws. Brynden's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite disapproval. Edmure let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Your Grace, Gerald stammered. I've never. You fought like a knight when it mattered, Rob cut in. The rest you'll learn. He clapped Sir Gerald once on the shoulder. Riverrun has a master-at-arms, he said. You'll report to him every day we're here. He'll teach you the sword proper. Gerald still looked stunned, but he swallowed and nodded. Your Grace. And when you're not in the yard, Rob added, lowering his voice just enough for Brindon and Edmure to hear, you'll be in the hall. You'll sit my counsels and keep your ears open. Listening is the first lesson of command. Sir Gerald seemed to struggle for words. I'll do as you say, your grace. Good, Rob said. He turned away, sheathing his sword. Now go find Sir Robin Roger and tell him I've given him a new headache. As Gerald backed away, still looking like a man in a dream, Edmure leaned in. You know you've just put ideas in 100 heads, he murmured. Every Levi who ever swung a spear's going to think he might be next. Let them, Rob said, watching Gerald go. If it makes them stand their ground when it matters, it'll be worth every jealous look from the highborn. He looked east, toward where the dread fort and all its lesser keeps lay somewhere beyond the river and hills. Root and stem, he reminded himself. We'll cut out every traitor and rip them away from our lands. Rob gave himself a brief moment to watch the knights and squires spar in the yard. For a heartbeat, he allowed himself that small escape, the clang of steel, the barked orders, the rhythm of training that belonged to a world before betrayal. It lasted only a moment. His gaze drifted to the blackfish. Uncle Rob said, voice steady. It's time. Gather the council. We have decisions to make. Brindon gave a curt nod and moved off at once, barking orders to pages and guards. Rob turned and made for Edmure's council chamber. The room was as large as Riverrun itself deserved, its long table wide enough that 3 grown men could lie head to foot across it, chairs spaced evenly along its length. The red and blue banners of House Tully hung on opposite walls so that no matter where a man sat, the trout watched him. One by one, the lords who had survived the twins entered the chamber. Some bore bandages. Others carried the hollow look of men who had escaped a slaughter only to realize what it had cost them. Gerald entered last and took a seat near the end of the table, stiff-backed and silent. Rob waited until the doors were shut. First and foremost he began, clearing his throat, I will not pretend the weight of what we lost does not sit on this table. At the mention of Talisa, his voice caught despite himself. He paused, forced himself to breathe. My wife is dead. My child with her. I will grieve them in my own time, but the realm does not wait for grief. There were murmurs of agreement. I have no heir, Rob continued. That is a weakness, and our enemies will see it as one. That must be addressed. But not today. He straightened. Send a raven to Castle Black. Inform the Lord Commander that I require Jon Snow released from his vows. Several heads snapped up. In return, Rob went on, the North and the Trident will supply the Watch with men, weapons, and grain. Lord Dunstan Tulizan spoke up. Your Grace, where will these men come from? We are already bleeding strength. He had reacted admirably in the Red Wedding, saving Stark and Tully men alike. His father, however, was one of the first people cut down. Rob's jaw tightened. From the traitors, he said. Every man who raised a sword against his king, whether it's a farmhand or lord's son alike, they will be given the same choice. The room went very still. Take the black, Rob said evenly, or lose their heads. His voice was calm now, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. Traitors who raise steel against their king deserve no quarter. If they wish to live, they have one choice, take the black, he added. But we will never forgive or forget treason. Rob's gaze swept the table. When it passed Gerald, he noticed the young knight's discomfort and filed it away for later. He needs to hear this, Rob thought. Even if he hates it. Root and stem, Rob finished. Every house that took part in the twins will be stripped of its lands and titles. Their family line will cease, destined to never rule another keep, hold fast or castle ever again. The North and the Trident will be made whole again by loyal hands. Rob wanted to continue. He needed the lords to know it would be absolute. The heads of every house that took part will be stripped naked and hanged as criminals. No exceptions. Rob growled, the lords around the table all muttered their agreement. Edmure and Brindon just nodded. Rob needed some advice as to what comes next. He wasn't thinking too clearly and just wanted to see blood pour. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, trying to alleviate the anger that was boiling inside of his chest. He knew he needed to rein himself in. Where are we on our men? Rob asked, looking around. Edmure spoke first. This was something he excelled at. Right now we have about 5,000 men of the Trident at Riverrun, Edmure said. Riverlords south of the Twins have been calling in their levies since word reached them. 5,000, Rob repeated. Better than he'd expected, and not what he meant. And how many survived the Twins? Rob asked, sharper. How many lived through the slaughter itself? Edmure's head dipped. About 400 we can account for, he said. Is that the Tully men? What of the men from the north? Rob clarified, hoping to hear a higher number. That is counting both Stark and Tully, my grace. Edmure stated, revealing the damage done. Bloody 7 fucking hells. Rob shouted, standing up and swiping his drink away in frustration. We had 3,500 men at that feast. 3,500. They killed over 3,000 men. Rob shouted once more. The lords at the table all just tightened up and kept their lips shut. Whatever fucking happens, I want every lord here to hear me and hear me plainly. I want Walder free alive. When I'm done with him, he will be begging for stranger to come take him. Rob revealed darkly. Rob paced around a bit. All of the lords remained seated, unsure as to what to do. Eventually Rob took a deep breath and sat back down. We need the Twins, Rob said, looking from face to face. Reuniting the North with the Riverlands is essential. Ideas? Gerald shifted at the far end of the table. Rob had told him to listen, not speak, but the young knight's mouth tightened as if the thought would choke him if he kept it in. Forgive me, me lords, ye grace, Gerald said, voice rough. But if we mean to take the castle, we need to do it quick. A few heads turned. One lord's mouth pinched as if he'd tasted something sour. They've just held a feast, Gerald went on, gaining courage. That means they've eaten through stores. If we cut the roads and the river, we starve them until they are forced to come out and fight. Rob studied him, and something like approval flickered behind his eyes. The plan wasn't complicated. That was the point. Simple plans survived bad days. Brynden leaned back in his chair, lips twitching. The Blackfish said. The lad speaks out of turn, but his words carry weight. Edmure sends ravens north of the crossing and have what loyal men remain gather on the far bank. We squeeze the Twins from both ends. Murmurs moved along the table. A few lords nodded. A few frowned. And how, one of them asked, do you mean to squeeze a castle that sits on the river like a spider in its web? They can fish. They can float in supplies. They can slip men across by night. Before Edmure could answer, an older man cleared his throat. Lucian Chambers sat straight-backed, hands folded, the sleeves of his doublet stained faintly with old pitch as if he'd come to war from the river itself. Ye grace, he said to Rob, respectful but firm. If you mean to starve the Twins, you must strangle the water. Several eyes turned his way, with some curious, some impatient. Chambers didn't flinch. My county of Brunstone is all river, he went on. Not one clean road through it without a ford or a bridge, and half the time those bridges might as well not exist when the rains come. For generations, my people have lived on what the water allows. We don't build carts first, we build boats. He tapped 2 fingers on the table like a boatwright marking timber. Skiffs. Flatboats. River barges. Ferries that can carry horses and men. If Brunstone couldn't cross its own waters, Brunstone would starve. That earned him attention. Even the men who'd looked ready to dismiss him now listened. Let me put every boatwright and carpenter I have to work. We'll have craft enough to move men up and down both banks faster than free scouts can ride. More than that, my grace, we'll stop anything from getting into the Twins. No merchant punts. No fishing boats. No quiet little barges drifting in after dark. Chambers said. Rob's eyes narrowed. He could already see it, river patrols, checkpoints, men with bows on the banks, the crossing watched day and night. Do it, Rob said at once. Lucian dipped his head. As you command, your grace. One final thing, Rob said firmly. Every eye in the chamber fixed on him. Lord Edmure. Lord Dunstan, you listen. It's time. Both men rose. Edmure gave Rob a small nod. Dunstan stepped forward and dropped to one knee. Edmure drew his sword and laid the flat of the blade lightly upon Dunstan's head. I, Dunstan of House Tulizon, Lord of Helmismont, pledge my life, my sword, and my honor to House Tully, from this day until my last day, Dunstan said clearly. I swear it by the old gods and the new. Edmure's expression stayed solemn, but his voice carried. I, Edmure of House Tully, accept your oath. I vow to bring you under my protection, to uphold the laws of the Trident, and to keep the realm's peace as best a lord may. He lowered the sword. Rise now as my sworn bannerman. He gripped Dunstan by both forearms and hauled him to his feet. Soft cheers moved through the council chamber, muted, weary, but real. Robb lifted a cup of wine and drank. As the lords filed out of the chamber, he glanced at Gerald. Stay, he said, more of a request than command. Gerald lingered, waiting until the last footstep faded down the hall. You did well, Robb said. Speaking when you did. His mouth twitched. Even though you did exactly what I told you not to do. Robb lightly teased. Gerald shifted, unsure whether to smile. Robb's tone softened. There's something I wanted to ask you. When I spoke of how the traitors will be dealt with, I saw it in your face. Disagreement. Gerald swallowed. Ye Grace, I can't. Speak your mind, Robb cut in, not unkindly. Clearly. That gave Gerald enough courage to breathe. Ye Grace, farmhands don't get choices. We never do. His hands tightened on the edge of the chair. Lord Umber's men shoved a spear into my hands and told me to fight. If I refused, I'd be thrown in a cell and called a coward, or I'd starve come winter and still be called a coward. There weren't choices, not truly. Robb studied him a moment, then nodded once. Robb said. I hear you. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me this, then. Did those farmhands, men like you, have time to warn a Stark, a Tully, or any loyal bannerman what their lords meant to do? Did they have time to slip a word to someone before they turned their spears on their king? Gerald went quiet. The answer sat heavy in his throat. He admitted at last. Some would have had time. Robb's voice stayed even. Then those who chose to raise steel against me are traitors all the same, he said. Highborn or low. Lord or farmhand. They'll be treated as such. The logic sank into Gerald like cold water. He didn't like it, but he understood it. He nodded. Robb exhaled, and the king's face eased away, replaced by something younger. Come, he said, standing. Let's find a proper bite to eat. Gerald smiled despite himself. He was starving. Chapter 5, The Road. Chapter text. Oliver kept his eyes ahead. They had been on the road for days, but he would not take the king's road unless he had to. Better the trees. Better the wet earth beneath their boots than the open track where any hungry man with a knife could see 3 travelers and think the gods had sent him supper. He guided them through the forest that ran alongside the road, close enough to keep their bearings, far enough to stay unseen. It took us 10 days to go from Riverrun to King's Landing when I came with my father, but that was on horseback. Sansa complained, brushing at a twig snagged in her hair. Don't tell me I must go that longer than that without a proper bath. Oliver glanced at her, then back to the path. If you find a bathhouse in these woods, my lady, do point it out. Until the Riverlands, you'll have to settle for a pond. A pond, Sansa repeated as if the word offended her. Myra stepped around a patch of mud and looked at him with that steady sweetness she kept even when she was afraid. Surely there will be one soon, Oliver. I'll see what I can do, he said, and meant it. With the reward you're seeking, Sansa said, the least you can do is make certain we bathe. That needled him more than it should have. No reward is being sought, Oliver answered. Is that so? Sansa's mouth curled. Your hands must be itching for dragons as gold as that cloak. Myra stopped short, eyes flashing. Sansa, enough. Can't you see he's trying to get us home? Must you speak of him as if he's no better than a cutpurse? Why shouldn't I? Sansa snapped. Why else would a gold cloak leave a post where he can take what he likes from small folk and still be paid for it? Men like him only care for coin. Oliver exhaled through his nose and ducked beneath a low branch, holding it aside so the women could pass. Then feel free not to come to Riverrun, he said dryly. I doubt it will be pristine enough for your tastes. Sansa huffed and pushed on ahead. When her footsteps faded a little, Oliver turned his head toward Myra. Tell me of your home, he said. Ironrath, was it? Myra's face softened. Yes. It's a wooden keep, but the timber is ironwood. Harder than common steel. My family holds a forest of it. The only place in Westeros those trees grow. Oliver pictured dark trunks like pillars, a green gloom so thick it could swallow men whole. Sounds like a place a boy could get lost in, he said. And never want to be found. A small smile tugged at Myra's mouth. Asher and Roderick used to take me into the trees. We'd play for hours. Asher, he dreamed of being Kingsguard. The smile faltered. Her eyes dipped. I miss him. Oliver didn't know what to say to that, not truly. So he offered what he could. Want to hear something strange, he asked instead. Myra looked up. What? This is the first time I've ever been outside King's Landing. Even Sansa glanced back at that, suspicion briefly displaced by surprise. You've never left? Myra asked. Not once. You've never seen a forest? Never, Oliver said. He lifted a hand to the trees around them. Not until now. Then how do you know where we're going? Sansa burst out. Oliver pointed through the trunks to the hard-packed track beyond. Because I was taught how to read a map, and I learned this route by heart. That road there is the King's Road. We shadow it north until Castle Deari. From Deari we turn west, follow the riverbank until the water splits and Riverrun sits where the Tumblestone meets the Red Fork. Myra nodded, relieved. Even Sansa seemed less ready to bite. Oliver's mouth twitched. I thought you were a highborn girl, he added. Shouldn't you know that? The woods thinned as they went, the trees giving way to stone and scrub. Ahead rose a low mountain, more along, stony shoulder than a true peak, and beyond it there was nothing to hide them but open plain and the hard line of the road. Oliver slowed, eyes narrowing. Shit. Myra's voice tightened. What is it? We'll have to take the road until we're past the mountain, Oliver said. Stay close. Hoods up. No talking unless you must. Both women pulled their hoods over their hair without a word. Oliver hated it. He'd wanted the trees the whole way, shade, cover, a place to vanish if riders appeared. The King's Road was different. The King's Road was where bandits hunted, bold as wolves, because they knew travelers had nowhere to run. Merchants paid for sellswords when they had sense. Those who didn't, ended up stripped, bleeding, and cold beside the wheel ruts. Now all that Myra and Sansa had was him. As their feet touched pavement, Oliver's hand went to the handle of his sword. Until they were off, he wouldn't lose grip of it, he vowed to himself. Sure enough, it only took a couple of hours. 4 men approached, wearing tattered down clothing. The men themselves all seemed they were in poor shape. They did all hold swords. From the looks of them, Oliver figured they had raided someone before and gathered the swords from them. Oliver raised a hand, palm out. Easy now. We're only passing through. The leader stepped forward, the other 3 hanging back like dogs behind their master. He grinned, showing cracked yellow teeth. I pass in through, he said. On our road. He spat to the side, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked past Oliver, at the girls. Was gonna say ye pay us a toll. Couple o' dragons. Nothing cruel. His grin widened. But, seeing as ye got company. One of the men behind him chuckled. Another muttered, pretty ones, that. The leader nodded, pleased with himself. How about we have our bit o' fun with them girls ye re-draggin' about, yeah? Then ye can go on your way. Might even leave ye both their cloaks, if I'm feeling kind. Myra's breath hitched. Oliver, don't. Oliver stepped forward. I've got a better offer, you shit stain. The 4 of you turn around and walk away while you still can. Say one more word about either of them, and it'll be the last day ye ever see. The leader laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. Oh, he said. Look at this little road knight. He leaned in, voice turning mean. Ye think one blade's gonna scare 4 men? We'll take your coin, take your steel, take. One of the others called out, eager, just cut him, Howl. Stop Join. The leader Howl said, never taking his eyes off Myra and Sangza. He started to step forward again. How we're going to. He didn't finish that sentence as Oliver quickly sliced right through his jugular. Before the man behind him to the left even realized what was happening, he had Oliver's sword through his chest. Finally, the other two drew up their swords as Oliver pried his blade free from the lifeless body. The third man charged, swinging hard. Oliver sidestepped him and slashed upward, chopping off his arm, then twirled with him and opened his throat, using his sword like it was a dagger. The fourth man just watched. In less than a couple of seconds, all three of his buddies were dead. He dropped his sword and started to run. Oliver didn't chase. He snatched up the fallen blade and threw it, burying it into the man's back as he fled. Myra and Sangza just stood there in shock. That was nothing like the dungeons, Myra said, trying to find the right words. You fight like a ravenous tiger, Sangza said, her voice quieter than it had been. Oliver simply wiped off his blade on the clothing of the men he'd killed and slid the sword back into its scabbard. Then he looked at Myra and smiled like the road hadn't just turned red. This is how I fight when I'm not drunk, he said. Both women remained stunned by what they'd witnessed. Come on. Let's get out of here. We don't want folk asking questions when they find these bodies, Oliver said, and kept walking. He did his best to hide his nerves, but he was still a bit shaken. Myra and then Sangza quickened their pace until they were at either side of him. Are you all right? Myra asked. I don't think he's used to people actually fighting back, Myra, Sangza prodded. Must have scared him. Oliver took a deep breath and tried to let it pass. Sangza spoke again, loud enough that he could not pretend he hadn't heard. You know gold cloaks, she said to Myra, sharp as a knife. They are used to beating on children, raping women, and threatening wounded men. It struck his last nerve. What in the seven hells is your problem with me? Oliver shouted. Sangza didn't flinch. You don't think I heard the stories? How Joffrey liked to have you beaten on a regular basis. The way you looked dead inside the whole time you were in King's Landing. Oliver drew in a breath through his nose, trying, but failing to keep his temper. You'd think, after what I did to get you out of that, you'd at least stop making me out to be some sort of monster, he yelled, heat rising in his face. Well, what else are you but a monster? Sangza snapped back. It was gold cloaks who seized my father, who pointed spears at him, who dragged him to a dungeon so he could be executed. You're the reason my father, the Honorable Ned Stark, is dead. There it was. The truth at last. You think I was there? Oliver said, voice tight. Myra went silent beside them. Sangza's eyes burned. You wore the cloak. Newsflash, Sangza, Oliver barked. I wasn't in the throne room. I wasn't even on the Red Keep detail. I was prowling Flea Bottom when that happened. The only time I was in the Red Keep was to sleep. He took a harsh step closer. Janos Slynt was a pompous jackass. He didn't want good gold cloaks, he wanted men willing to suck his dick for a gold dragon. That wasn't me. He shouted. Just admit it. You only dragged me out of there because you know my brother would reward you handsomely to return me. There is nothing honorable about you, Oliver. You're just some cutthroat looking to make it rich, Sangza shot back. Myra stared daggers at her. Sangza, how dare you? Myra shouted, stepping between them. You think he would risk his neck, fight the people he had to fight and do all the things he's done, and you make him out to be someone that despicable? Myra yelled louder this time. Oliver had been more than loyal. He'd fought to the death for them. He didn't deserve this. Get it through your skull, Myra. I love you like a sister, but if you can't see he only did it for the gold my brother would give him, then you're a fool, Sangza snapped. That one bit Oliver deep. He couldn't hold it back anymore. You want the truth, Sangza? Oliver asked, venom dripping from every word. Go on, then. Tell us, Sangza demanded. The truth is, Oliver's voice rose. You were never the prize. You weren't the one I meant to save. It was her. He jabbed a finger toward Myra. She's kind. Decent. Honorable. The thought of her head on a block made me sick to my stomach. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I allowed her to be executed. She was the only thing I wanted to get out that night. His eyes snapped back to Sangza, hard. And you? He spat the word. All you ever were to me and all you ever have been, is extra baggage. Baggage I'm starting to wish I'd left in King's Landing. That last line that shot out of Oliver's mouth hit Sangza hard. For the first time during the exchange she had nothing left to say, but this feeling of worthlessness all over again filling her. 3 men rode up on the road. Oliver had his hand to his sword again. Making them out, it was clear they were on horseback. He had hoped they were Tully men, it would make things much easier. As the riders came closer he could make out the silhouette of the men. They were wearing free garbs, and a smile cracked open on Oliver's lips. They were Tully men. 3 men rode up the road, and Oliver's hand went to his sword again. Even at a distance it was clear they were mounted. He'd hoped they were Tully men, it would make things much easier. As the riders came closer he made out their cloaks. Free garb, and a smile cracked open on Oliver's lips. Tully bannerman. The 3 horses reined in a few paces short of him. What business have you 3? The first free man asked. He looked like he was in his mid-30s, with the hard, watchful look of a professional soldier. They all did. We're on our way to Riverrun, Oliver said. Trying to keep clear of bandits. He was relaxed now, his hand away from his sword. If this went well, they'd have help escorting the women the rest of the way. The front man glanced back at the 2 behind him. One raised an eyebrow, curious. Either free said at last. Riverrun's road isn't safe right now. Lannister patrols. He tipped his chin toward the north. You'll be safer with us back to the twins. Something crawled in Oliver's gut. Shame, he said. We'll head there anyway. I've a brother who's master at arms at Riverrun. I mean to see him. Sangza and Myra edged closer to him. Ah, I insist, dear friend, the rider said, too smooth. Just hand over your sword, and we'll escort you 3 to the twins. It's safe there. We'll send word to your brother. Oliver looked at him a long moment. He gave Myra's hand a tight squeeze, then let his other hand drift toward his sword. Yeah. Oliver said, voice flat. I don't think so. The 3 riders swung down from their horses and drew steel. Oliver told the girls to go hide, and went forward. Oliver struck first. He had to, if he had any chance at all, he needed one of them down fast. These weren't bandits. These were trained men. He slashed for the lead man's throat. The free peeled back at the last instant, and Oliver missed the jugular by a fingernail. Steel flashed from Oliver's right, he caught it on his blade. Another came from the left a heartbeat later, and he parried that too, quick and tight. The man in the middle lunged in a stabbing thrust. Oliver twisted his head aside and the point missed, but it nicked his cheek as the free dragged the blade back. Oliver stepped back. Shit, he muttered, pressing a hand to his cheekbone. Warm blood slicked his fingers. Not deep, but enough. He couldn't fight them head on. He had to start backpedaling, draw them after him and make them come one at a time. That was the only way. Oliver gave ground. One man sprang forward, blade swinging, forcing Oliver to meet him steel to steel. Their blades locked. With a quick twist of his wrist, Oliver rode the free's blade up, then chopped for his head and caught nothing but air as the free ducked under it. Oliver took a deep breath and tried to calm himself, but his nerves were screaming. One free lunged in a stabbing thrust while another swung for his head. Oliver gave ground again, forcing the swing to whistle through empty air. He needed an opening. An opening, and then he saw it. They'd spread to take him, one on his left, one in front, and the closest on his right. The man on the right chopped down. Oliver stepped inside the falling strike and drove his blade up into the man's armpit, where the male gaped. The free screamed. Oliver shoved him hard and threw him into the man in the middle, buying himself a heartbeat of chaos. 1-on-1. Oliver struck fast, fast as he could, forcing the center man to backpedal, barely keeping steel between them. Then Oliver flicked his wrist and changed targets, off the body and onto the sword hand. He hit it. The free howled as his grip failed and the sword flopped into the dirt. Oliver turned and felt a blade rake his belly. He wore chainmail, but it only blunted the worst of it. Rings tore and something underneath split anyway. A searing line of pain cut across his abdomen, hot and immediate. He stumbled backwards, then caught himself and then pointed his sword at the man that just slashed him. Oliver struck first and high at the man's head, forcing a parry. The instant steel met, he rolled his wrists and dropped the point, arcing the blade down into the man's thigh. The cut was vicious. Deep enough to buckle him. The Free screamed, legs folding under him, and Oliver didn't hesitate and he drove his sword straight down through the man's throat and ripped it free. To his side, the second man was still on his knees, sobbing like a child, clutching his ruined sword hand. Blood spat between his fingers in frantic pulses. Oliver walked to him and ended it with a single thrust, steel sliding into his throat like it belonged there. Then pain flared across the back of Oliver's thigh. Hot. Sharp. Immediate. "Ah fuck," he roared, turning, and the man he'd cut under the armpit earlier was there, half mad and still fighting with his remaining arm. The frizz blade dragged through Oliver's leg, hamstringing him just enough to steal his footing. Oliver staggered and felt cold iron punch in at the edge of his belly, where his mail didn't quite cover. Low, at the side. Not a clean gutting, but deep enough to burn like fire as the point slid in and out. His breath left him in a soundless gasp. On instinct, he answered. He drove his own sword up under the man's ribs right into the soft place and straight into the heart. The Free went slack and dropped. Oliver stumbled after him. His sword slipped from his fingers and hit the dirt. His hand went to his side, pressing hard against the wet heat spreading beneath the torn rings. Not the center. Not opened wide. I can live, he told himself, teeth clenched. If I get a maester. Fast. Oliver. Myra screamed, running to him. Oliver tried to catch himself, stumbling, fighting to stay upright before his legs gave out. Sansa was at his side too. Come on, she said, forcing a thin, light-hearted edge into her voice. Get up. Who else am I supposed to torment? Oliver looked at her. Get the horses, he rasped. You and Myra need to go. Sansa's eyes hardened. No, she said. You don't get to die. She grabbed two sets of reins and dragged the horses closer. With Sansa's help, Myra hauled Oliver into the saddle. He barely managed to stay there, swaying. Myra climbed up behind him and wrapped her arms around him to steady him, taking the reins in her hands. Sansa mounted the third horse. Sansa looked at Oliver again. You listen to me, Goldcloak, she said, putting steel into her voice. I'm Sansa Stark, sister of the king. I command you to live. Oliver huffed a laugh, then groaned as pain punished him for it. Even through the haze, he knew what she was doing. They rode hard. Hours later, Riverrun rose ahead of them, huge against the sky. Oliver fought to stay awake, but his strength was leaking away with every heartbeat. His vision swam. His grip went slack. He started to slide. Oliver. Myra cried, tightening her hold, but his body was too heavy. He slipped off the saddle and hit the ground hard. Myra looked up. Riverrun was close now. Minutes. Sansa stopped, took one look at them, then dug her heels in and sent her horse flying toward the gates. Oliver's eyes fluttered open. Myra was above him, her face tight with fear. He managed a small, crooked smile. I got you to safety, he whispered. I did what I needed to do. His voice thinned. I'm sorry. I won't get to see Ironrath with you. Tears gathered in Myra's eyes. Yes, you will, she said fiercely. You have to. You need to see the forest with me. Meet my brother Roderick. I know you two would get along. Her hands came up, cradling his face like she could hold him to the world by touch alone. Myra. Oliver's voice broke. I love you. I've always been in love with you. I'm sorry. His eyes drifted shut. And this time, he couldn't win the fight to keep them open. Chapter 6, Vows Released. Chapter Text. Jon pushed himself up in the dim of Castle Black, breath misting in the cold. The wounds where Ygritte had shot him was healing tight and sore but closing. He hated leaving her. He'd had no choice. His first duty was to the watch, no matter what his heart wanted. One day the wildlings would come for the war, and he found himself praying to the old gods, knew, any higher power that listened, that he would not be made to face her across the snow. Jon knew he would not be able to do it. Jon Snow, Janos Slynt called, arrogance clinging to every word. You've been summoned by Sir Alisa. Jon made sure Longclaw sat easy in its scabbard. Now, you damn bastard. Slynt barked when Jon didn't move fast enough. Jon stepped in close, so close there was barely a finger's breadth between them, and said nothing at all. He only stared. Slynt held it for a heartbeat, then he cowered away, leaving his quarters. Janos Slynt led the way as if he owned the place. Jon found himself following, boots scraping over hard-packed snow and old stone. Sir Alisa Thorne had always been against him. Yet Jon could never deny this much: Thorne wanted what was best for the war. They only differed on what best meant. The room was cold enough to bite. Thorne sat behind a scarred wooden desk, shoulders squared, as if the chair were a command. "You sent for me," Jon said, cutting through the silence. Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Your brother, your boy king, has made demands of the Night's Watch." The words were sour in his mouth. "As if I need reminding, we do not bend the knee to Winterfell. We serve the realm." He let that hang for a heartbeat. Then, "He wants you released from your vows." Jon didn't move. For a moment he only stared, as if he'd misheard. "Our vows are for life," he said at last, voice rough. "They can't." Thorne cut in. "They are." Jon's throat tightened. "Then what are you saying?" Thorne leaned forward slightly, and Jon saw it, something that might have been satisfaction, thin as a knife edge. Not kindness. Relief. "I'm saying your brother is offering men grain, steel, supplies." Thorne spat the words like he hated needing them. "And we need that a damned sight more than we need one man, bastard or lordling, I care not." Jon's chest pulled two ways at once. Home, and the war. Robb, and his brothers. Thorne's hand moved, pushing a sealed raven scroll across the desk as if it was poison. "Perhaps this will make it plain." His mouth curled. "Go get your things, and get the hell off my wall." He watched Jon like he expected him to argue. Like he wanted him to. Instead, Jon reached over and read the scroll. "Jon. At Edmure Tully's wedding we were betrayed beneath guest right. House Free and House Bolton turned their knives on us. My wife and unborn child are dead. My mother is dead. Grey Wind is dead. I live. I am cut off from the north, but I will not leave it in the hands of traitors. You are released from your vows by agreement with the Night's Watch. Go to the north at once. Raise the banners in my name. March on Roose Bolton. Take his head and seize the dread fort. Any man who takes up arms for Bolton is to be given two choices: take the black or lose his head. I will deal with the phrase and come north as soon as I am able. Hold fast until then. Your brother, Robb Stark. King in the North End of the Trident." Jon read the letter, and the words fell on him hard. He had always respected Lady Catelyn, even though she had never loved him. And Grey Wind. But it was Talisa and the unborn child that truly turned his stomach. He had never met them, yet the thought of it still weighed on him. Jon tried to imagine Ygritte bleeding out beside him while he remained standing, and found no words for what he would become. He would want the realm to burn. He felt that fire for his brother. Jon drew a slow breath and shoved it all down where duty lived. He rolled the scroll tight, tucked it beneath his cloak, and raised his eyes to the acting Lord Commander. "I've everything I need on me," Jon said. "I ask only one thing. A horse." Thorne grunted. "Janos," he said without looking away from Jon, "give the man a horse and see him off. I'm tired of the sight of him." Slynt moved at once. As Jon swung up into the saddle, Gren, Pyp, and Samwell Tarly hurried over to him. "Jon, what's going on?" Sam asked. Jon's face was set with grim determination, but instead of riding north toward the wildlings, he was turned south. It made no sense. "I've been released from my vows," Jon said. His eyes were wide, as if the words still didn't fit in his mouth. Gren found his voice first. "What?" he croaked. "My brother arranged it," Jon said quietly. "My enemy is to the south now. Like hell it is." PYP snapped. Anger was rising in him, sharp and sudden. "We need you here. You're our brother in black." Jon stilled, then climbed back down from the stirrup. He stepped to PYP and put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm no longer of the black," Jon said, "but I will always be your brother." He pulled PYP into a hug. PYP hugged him back, hard. Jon did the same for Gren, then for Sam. "Jon, please," Sam pleaded. "There has to be something we can do." "It's already done," Jon said softly. Then he looked to Gren and PYP. "Do me one thing. Don't let Sam stand alone. Not ever." "I promise," Gren said at once. "So do I," PYP added. "We'll take care of him." Jon mounted again, nodded to the three of them, and rode out of Castle Black. Jon knew he needed to go to the first major house that was closest to Castle Black, which ended up being House Glover at Deepwood Motte. The trek was hard, and long. By the time that Jon had gotten there 2 days had passed and he was starving. His last meal was when he was a brother at the wall. The sight of Deepwood Motte was rather unimpressive compared to the likes of Winterfell. However, it had its own charms. Wooden Keep, with its long hall sitting on top of a hill, had a large watchtower and a moat filled with spikes surrounding it. It was clear if anyone attacked, they would have to fight like hell to take it. "Halt, state your business." A guard at the top shouted. Jon was alone on horseback near the front gate. "I'm Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell. I have orders from my brother, King Robb Stark of the North and the Trident." The man gave him a hard look, then motioned down to the men below him controlling the gate. The gate had barely groaned open before a rider met him in the yard, older, broad-shouldered, grey in his beard. His eyes flicked over Jon's face and stopped. The gate had barely groaned open before a rider met him in the yard, older, broad-shouldered, grey in his beard. His eyes flicked over Jon's face and stopped. "Jon Snow," the man said, like it was already known. "Ned Stark's son." Jon nodded. "Galbart Glover." A thin smile tugged at the Lord's mouth. "Aye. It's been too long, Jon. Come, let's hear what the king wants." Galbart led Jon to the Lord's council table at Deepwood Motte. When the door shut behind them, he turned with a stern look. The warmth was still there, but the room felt colder all the same. "What does King Robb command?" he asked bluntly. Like most Northmen, he didn't waste breath circling a question, he went straight through it. "Robb has commanded me to call the banners," Jon said, just as blunt. "I'll ask you to do the same here. After that, we muster at Winterfell. Then we march on the Dread Fort, and Roose Bolton dies." Jon held Galbart's gaze a moment, then added, "But first, I need to know the situation as you see it." Galbart's jaw tightened. "I tried to call my banners," he said. "Whitehill refused. They claim their new liege lord is House Bolton. They've been harassing House Forrester for some time now." He paused, as if choosing what to say first, and then let it spill. "They killed Ethan Forrester while he held Ironrath. Gregor died at the Red Wedding. Roderick was assumed dead, but his body came home a day after Ethan's murder. Luckily, he wasn't dead, just badly wounded. He's on his own 2 feet now, ruling." Jon's stomach turned. "I rode to Ironrath with what reinforcements I could spare," Galbart went on. "I meant to hold their lands and beat Whitehill back. But the Whitehills returned with Bolton men behind them. I failed. We were routed." He exhaled through his nose, anger and shame mixed together. "I don't know how long House Forrester can last. Ethan sent for his elder brother Asher back from Essos. They say he's a gifted swordsman. But numbers win wars, not songs. And I don't have enough men to save them alone." Galbart's eyes hardened. "I've heard rumors the Karstarks have declared for Roose as well." Jon drew a slow breath, forcing the fury down into something useful. "Then we answer with ravens," Jon said. "Send word to every major house, Carhold included. If they answer the call, they are with us. If they refuse, they are traitors, and we will treat them as such. Tell them I call the banners by order of Robb Stark, King in the North and of the Trident. Tell them we are taking back the North. Jon's voice dropped, turning iron cold. The North remembers. He met Galbart's eyes again. And send one more raven to House Forrester. Tell them they are not forgotten. Tell them the North stands behind them, and help is coming. Galbart's mouth curled into a fierce smile. He rose, stepped in close, and half smacked, half gripped Jon's shoulder like a man greeting a brother before battle. Let's kill some fucking traitors, he growled. Jon nodded. Get as many men as you can. We ride to Winterfell, Jon said. Galbart Glover could only muster 800 men. The fighting outside Ironrath, where he'd been routed, had torn deep into his levies. Still, having Glover at his side made Jon feel less alone in this. They reached Winterfell, and the ravens began to return. Every great house answered the call save Carhold. Their reply was short and cold. We hold to our Lord Paramount, Roose Bolton. We recognize no king in the north. Soon after, men began arriving in person, Black Pines, Edgewood, the northern mountains. Each day brought more banners, more campfires, beyond the walls. Their numbers swelled to 5,000, and climbing. But it was not all good news. Ravens came from Crestview, Everstead, and Hornwood. They'd been set upon by Karstark riders and Bolton men before they could reach Winterfell. After brutal fighting, the traitors held the field, routing all three banners. Jon paced the great hall with the weight of it pressing on his chest. Soon the enemy would come for Winterfell. Part of him wanted to ride straight for the Dread Fort and smash the Boltons in their own yard and crush the rebellion at the root. But if he did that while the Forresters bled, if he let a loyal house be ground down to nothing, what right did House Stark have to call itself protector of the North? He was turning the choice over day by day, forcing himself to decide, when the decision seemed to come to him instead. My Lord Benfred Tallheart said, stepping forward. He was a few years older than Jon, heir to Edgewood. His father had sent him to command their levies while he held their lands. There's a man at the gate asking to see you. Bring him in, Jon said plainly. The doors opened, and a confident man in his mid-twenties strode into the hall. Blonde-haired, green-eyed, hard around the edges. Jon could tell at a glance he'd seen his share of steel. My lord, the man said. I'm Asher Forrester. I have news. Jon watched him a moment. Let's hear it. I've been corresponding with Gwyn Whitehill, Lord Whitehill's daughter, Asher said. She's given me a way into High Point. A way to slip inside and open the gates. Jon's eyes narrowed. Why would she do that? Asher's jaw tightened. Because her family is rotten. She knows it. She may love them, but she can't stomach what they are doing to mine. And you expect me to stake men on the word of a traitor? Jon said, sharp as a blade. You're asking me to gamble lives on a Whitehill promise. Asher's face twisted, anger flashing in his eyes. Then don't risk yours, he said. Risk mine. I brought a few friends from Essos with me, and what little men my house can spare. I'll open the gates for you. Jon studied him. It was a bold offer. Too bold. What makes you think this isn't a trap? Jon demanded. That you and your friends won't be cut down the moment you try. Asher didn't hesitate. She would never betray me. There it was. Jon saw it in his face, in his voice. You love her, Jon said. Not a question. A fact. Yes, Asher replied. I don't expect you to understand what it's like to love someone your family calls an enemy. But what we have, she would never betray it. Jon held his gaze a long moment. Believe it or not, Jon said quietly, I know exactly what that feels like. He turned slightly toward the benches. I'll have Lord Glover give you 10 good men to go with you and your Essosi friends. You get that gate open? Asher nodded once. Yes, my lord. And then he was gone, striding back out of Winterfell's hall as if he'd already chosen his battlefield. Chapter 7, Reunion. Chapter text. Sansa put her heels to the horse and drove it straight onto the drawbridge. Men shouted from the walls. A spearhead flashed up at the far end, and crossbows angled down toward her chest. Hold, a guard yelled. Stop there. Songza didn't stop. Not until the horse's hooves rang on the planks and she was near enough to smell the wet wood and iron. "Open the gate," she cried. "Open it, please. We need help." "Name yourself," the man above called down, voice hard as a helm. "I am Songza Stark of Winterfell," she shouted back. "Sister to King Robb." A laugh answered her, short and ugly. And I'm Aegon the Conqueror." "Begone, girl. Lady Songza's in King's Landing." "Please," Songza said, and the words scraped out of her. She glanced back into the rain, down the road where Myra fought to keep a wounded man in the saddle. "I need a maester now. He's dying. Dying men don't buy you entry." The guard's tone sharpened. "Is this free work? You take us for fools." "I'm no free." Songza screamed, fury and fear twisting together. "I'm Songza Stark." Inside the gatehouse, the shout carried through stone. Robb's head snapped up as if someone had struck him. He knew that voice. He hadn't heard it since his father rode south, but he knew it all the same, clear as a blade drawn in the dark. He was moving before anyone finished speaking. Your Grace," a runner stammered as Robb thundered onto the bridge. "There's a girl, she claims she's..." Robb didn't slow. He leaned over the railing, staring down into the rain. "Songza," he breathed. Her head jerked up at once. "Robb. Open the bloody gate," Robb shouted, and there was no pleading in it, only command. Your Grace, it could be..." the guard began. Robb's gaze cut to him like a knife. "Open it now." Chains groaned. The portcullis began to rise. And as the gap widened, Robb saw her at last completely soaked through, shaking in the saddle, her long auburn hair plastered to her shoulders, his sister riding out of the storm as if she'd clawed her way back from a grave. The gates groaned open. Robb was through before the portcullis had even finished rising, boots splashing in the wet as he reached for her. He dragged Songza down from the saddle and held her hard against him, as if letting go might make her vanish. "You need to help him," Songza cried into his shoulder. "Please, help him. He needs a maester." Robb pulled back, hands still gripping her arms. Her face was streaked with rain and tears, eyes wide and shining. For a heartbeat he could only stare at her, trying to make sense of the impossible. Behind him, men at arms gathered in a half-circle, watching as if they'd stumbled into a tale. "Maester!" Robb barked, turning his head. "Now. And you, come with me." A few swordsmen moved at once, metal and leather creaking as they fell in behind him. Robb looked back to Songza. "Show me." She didn't answer, she just turned and ran, boots slipping on the stones as she led him toward the road. Robb followed, and then he saw. A girl knelt in the mud, shoulders shaking, bent over a man laid out like a fallen standard. Myra Forrester, Gregor Forrester's daughter, with her hands red, her face twisted with grief she didn't have time for. The man beside her wore the armor of a King's Landing gold cloak, though the cloak itself was gone. Blood darkened his gamison. His breathing was thin and wrong. Robb's brow furrowed, anger and confusion colliding in his chest. "Careful," he ordered, voice low and sharp. "Lift him. Don't jostle him. Carry him back and do exactly what the maester tells you, understood?" The men moved in, cautious as if the wounded man might break apart in their hands. And as if his words had summoned it, Maester Vimen came hurrying into the rain, cloak flapping, lantern bobbing in his grip. Robb looked at Myra and Songza. "Both of you inside," Robb said. "You'll be fed, and then you'll tell me how you escaped." His eyes cut to the wounded man as they lifted him, venom tightening his voice. "And you can explain what that gutter rat is doing here?" Robb said, his eyes pointing at the wounded gold cloak. "Don't you talk about him like that." Myra snapped. The grief in her face collapsed into rage. "You have no fucking idea what he did to get us home. Don't you dare dishonor him." Myra continued. She looked at Robb like daggers. The bite of it caught him off guard. Robb pressed his jaw shut, swallowed the first retort that came, and nodded once. "Then come with me," he said. "Tell me what happened." Riverrun's maester worked with grim urgency, having the gold cloak carried to his chambers. Robb, meanwhile, escorted Songza and Lady Forrester to the Tully Council room, shutting the door behind them as the noise of the yard fell away. "What happened?" Robb demanded. "How did you get free of the Lannisters?" He could not pretend otherwise. The man in gold had been the hinge of it, else Robb would have left him in the mud. Myra swallowed, forcing herself steady. "I wrote to my father, my grace. The Lannisters found out and sentenced me to death. I wrote nothing against them, I missed him." "They would have you executed for ink?" Robb asked, disbelief cutting through his exhaustion. Your grace." Myra's hands trembled in her lap. I was friends with Oliver. We met in the gardens when he was posted near the Red Keep. He told me of parts of the city I was never allowed to see. I told him of Ironrath, of my family. He was always kind. I only learned the truth shortly before you found him, and I—" Her voice faltered. Robb crossed to the sideboard and poured wine into 2 cups, setting one before Myra and one before Sansa. "Drink," he said, softer than before. Then, to Myra, "Go on." Myra drew a breath. "When I was arrested, they dragged me down to the cells. I'd given up. I thought I was going to die. On the way, I saw Oliver. He spoke to the guards as if I meant nothing. As if I was already dead." Robb's eyes narrowed. Myra's throat bobbed. "Only, it wasn't true. When they threw me into the cell, 2 dungeon guards came after me. They—" She clenched her jaw, forcing the words out. "They meant to force themselves on me." Robb went very still. "I thought," Myra whispered. "And then I saw him. Oliver came into the dungeons and killed them. Both of them. He got the keys, dragged me out, and, when I stumbled out of the cells, I saw Lady Sansa." Robb exhaled hard through his nose, anger sharpening. He held it down. "Enough," he said, not unkindly. "Take a moment, Lady Forrester." Myra blinked fast, tears threatening. She nodded, staring at the wine as if it were a lifeline. Robb turned to his sister. "Sansa, tell me your part. How did you get out?" Sansa's mouth tightened. Rain had dried on her lashes, but the fear was still there beneath her composure. "I didn't know him," she said quietly. "Not really. I'd seen him before. The gold cloaks are everywhere in that city, but we never spoke." Robb waited, eyes fixed on her. "One night, my guards at my door were gone." Sansa's voice cracked, then steadied again. "I heard a struggle in the corridor. When I opened the door, a man stood there with blood on his hands. It was Oliver. He told me if I wanted to see my family again, I had to come then. Not tomorrow. Not after I thought it through. Then." "And you went?" Robb said. "I went." Sansa swallowed. "He said he had to save someone first. He took me down into the dungeons, gods." "Robb." Her hands curled around the cup without drinking. "He brought Myra out. And then we ran." They told him the rest, quietly at first, then faster as the words finally spilled free: "The woods, the bandits on the King's Road, the free men who tried to take them back." Their accounts matched, each filling gaps the other couldn't. Robb listened, jaw tight. For wearing the lion's gold, Robb had wanted to string the man up. Yet from the way they spoke and what he had done, what it had cost him, Robb found something worse than anger creeping in. Respect. When the tale ended, the room sat in heavy silence. "What am I supposed to do with this Oliver?" Robb asked at last, half to himself. Myra and Sansa both looked at him almost pleading, though neither of them dared to say the word. Robb held up a hand. "Enough. I won't do anything foolish." His eyes hardened again, because they had to. "This story is incredible. If he weren't so torn up, I'd think it a Lannister ploy." Sansa tensed. Myra's breath caught. "If he lives," Robb continued, "I'll not hang him out of hand. I'll let him earn his place here under watch, and on my terms." Myra let out a shaky breath she'd been holding. Sansa's shoulders eased the slightest bit. Robb looked to his sister, and something in him softened, then broke. "Sansa," he began, and the word came out rough. "There is something you should know." Myra started to rise. "Your Grace, I should." "No," Robb said gently, stopping her. Stay. There are things you must know as well. Sangza read the regret in his voice before the words arrived. Her fingers reached across the table and closed around his hands. What are you trying to tell me, Rob? She asked, very softly. My bannermen have begun to call it the Red Wedding, Rob said. I suppose it fits. Uncle Edmure rode to the twins to wed Roslyn Free. After the vows. His voice caught. He blinked hard, but the tears still gathered. What aren't you telling me? Sangza asked, dread rising in her throat. Rob's jaw worked once, like he had to force the words out past something lodged there. They killed our mother, Sangza. My wife. My child. Grey Wind. His eyes shone. They butchered them. Sangza went very still, as if her body hadn't yet accepted what her ears had heard. The Freys and the Boltons staged the whole thing with the Lannisters, Rob went on, bitterness turning each word sharp. That's why the Freys tried to take you when they saw you on the road. They're no longer sworn to Uncle Edmure. They've bent the knee to the Iron Throne, to that bastard boy, Joffrey. Sangza's face crumpled. The sound that left her wasn't a sob at first, more a breaking. Then the tears came in a rush she couldn't stop. Rob looked like he might come apart with her, his own grief held together by sheer will. Myra slid her arms around Sangza and pulled her close, trying to keep her upright. Rob dragged a hand over his mouth and tried again. I didn't get out on my own, he said, voice breaking. A spearman, one of ours, dragged me from the hole when the knives came out. Without him, I'd have died there too. He swallowed, eyes shining. We clawed our way out with what Stark and Tully men we could gather. Not many. His gaze dropped to the table, as if he couldn't bear to see their faces when he said it. And your father, Myra? Sir Gregor Forrester? No. Myra whispered, already knowing. He was an honorable man, Rob said, grief flattening his voice. He didn't make it. Myra rose from her chair as if the room had turned too small to hold her. She managed 3 steps before her knees gave out and she sank to the floor, sobbing into her hands. Rob watched with tears in his own eyes, the grief still raw as an open wound. Sangza was crying now too, quiet at first, then shaking with it while Myra's sobs filled the chamber like a storm. He stayed a few minutes longer, helpless, saying nothing because there was nothing to say that didn't feel small. At last he left, awkwardly, like a man fleeing his own heart. He found Uncle Edmure and spoke low. Post guards outside the Gold Cloak's door. 2 at all hours. Edmure frowned. He can barely breathe, Rob. I know, Rob said, voice tight. But until I know what he is, I won't have him unwatched. From there Rob went through Riverrun's corridors until he found Maester Vimen. Vimen was bent over the wounded man, hands steady, placing the last bandages with the calm of long practice. You did not serve a major house like House Tully as Maester unless you were counted among the best. Rob paused in the doorway. How is he? This man, whoever he is lucky to be alive, Vimen said, wiping his hands on a cloth. Whether he lasts the night or the next, we shall see. Rob's throat tightened. What are his odds? He must wake, the Maester said plainly. He has lost too much blood. If he does not wake within a day or 2. Vimen let the rest hang. You mean he'll die, Rob said. Aye, your grace. Vimen's eyes didn't flinch. If he wakes, he has a fighting chance, good odds, so long as the wounds do not fester. I will do everything in my power to prevent it. But if I had to wager. He glanced down at the still face. I would say he is nearer the stranger than the living, just now. Rob nodded once. The words sat heavy in his chest. He would have to tell them, better now than after hope had grown teeth. He returned to the council room. Sangza and Myra were still there, both trying to pull themselves back together, eyes red and swollen. They looked up as he entered. Your Grace? Myra asked, voice thin. It's about your gold cloak, Oliver. Rob kept his tone steady by force. The Maester has done all he can. He still draws breath, but Vimen doesn't think he will live, not unless he wakes soon. The next few days will decide it. Myra's face shifted, grief giving way to fear so fast it was almost worse. Sangza said nothing, only lowered her eyes, as if she could not bear one more death named aloud. Your Grace, Myra whispered, if I may. I would like to sit with him. To be at his side. Robb nodded. Go. And I'll have a raven sent to Winterfell so they may send word on to Ironrath. Your house will know you are safe. Myra's breath shuddered out. Thank you, Your Grace. She left the room, hurrying as if she could outrun the fear. Sansa remained. She stood slowly, looking at Robb as though he might break if she touched him. We need to make them pay, she said, and there was steel under the tears. The Freys. The Boltons. The Lannisters. All of them. Robb said, his own voice hardening around the vow. And we will. He drew a slow breath. But we are cut off from the north. I had Jon released from the Watch and he's calling banners now to take it back. Robb's eyes sharpened. We will take the twins and reunite our lands. He leaned in, quiet and fierce. Then we will make the Lannisters choke on their own blood. Chapter 8, Siege at High Point. Chapter text. Asher could see the night sky clearly, thousands of stars scattered across the dark. Beskha crouched beside him, close enough that he could hear her breathing. The former slave had become a talented warrior, one Asher was grateful had followed him from Essos. Did you find it, West AOC? Beskha whispered, using the old nickname she'd given him across the narrow sea. Asher didn't answer at once. He and the men Jon Snow had provided were lined along the castle wall, keeping to shadow and stone. Gwyn had said the entrance would be on the eastern side. From there they'd have to move along the tower passages, reach the gatehouse, get down the steps, and open the gate from within. With the castle dark for hours now, Asher was counting on board guards and heavy eyelids. He murmured at last. He'd noticed it a moment before, a section of masonry that looked ordinary until you stared too long. A few stones sat wrong. Not enough for a passing eye to catch, but enough for someone hunting a seam. Asher pressed his palm against the block and leaned in. The stone gave with a soft grind, turning like a hidden latch. A narrow gap opened, breathing out cold air and darkness. Asher drew his sword and slipped inside. The passage was black and stale. Beskha reached for a wall sconce, coaxed the torch to life with practiced hands, and passed it forward. Asher took it without looking, then another torch went to one of Snow's men, then another, just enough to see, not enough to announce them. Dust lay thick on the floor. Spider webs clung to the corners like old bandages. The sconces themselves looked untouched, as if no one came this way unless they had to. At the end of the passage, Asher eased his torch into its iron bracket and lifted a finger to his lips. The men behind him went still. He cracked the door open. A guard turned, his eyes widening at once, mouth beginning to form a shout. Asher stepped in and drove his blade up under the man's jaw. The sound died in the guard's throat. Asher caught him before he could hit the stones, lowering him gently to the floor. Then he crouched, wiped the blood from his blade against the man's cloak, and started toward the gatehouse fast and silent, with Beskha at his shoulder. Asher knew they still had a long way to go. First they had to reach the nearest tower, then make their dash for the gatehouse. At the bottom they would find the wheel that raised the portcullis. Jon Snow was waiting outside, hidden in the ditches beneath the road that led to the gates. He'd told Asher he would lead the vanguard himself the moment the gate began to lift. Asher only had to do his part. He rounded the corner and caught the gleam of mail. A white hillman at arms stood near the tower, half in shadow. For an instant the guard's eyes met Asher's. "Ring the bell," the man shouted. "We've got." He didn't finish. Beskha's spear punched through his chest and drove him back in a spray of blood. The man hit the stones hard and went still. But the surprise was gone. Asher glanced over his shoulder. The men Glover had sent already had their swords out, faces set and ready. "Move!" Asher barked out, and then he was running. They sprinted for the northeast tower, boots hammering stone. A shout rose behind them. Another answered. White Hill soldiers poured into the passageways like ants from a kicked mound. The first man met Asher inside the tower stair, swinging for his head. Asher caught the blow above him with his sword, steel shrieking, and then drove his hatchet into the side of the man's neck. The man dropped without even a second cry. A second lunged in, trying to skewer him. Asher knocked the point aside as if swatting a fly and snapped his sword up in the same motion, taking the man's head clean off. It tumbled down the steps, bouncing once before it came to rest. Beskha was just as deadly. By the time Asher looked her way, she'd already dropped 4 more, eyes bright and merciless. Behind them, the Northmen were holding, one down on their side, while White Hill men were littering the stones by the handful. "We don't stop!" Asher shouted. "Follow me." He took the stairs 2 at a time and drove them down into the tunnel that led toward the gatehouse. This was the most dangerous part. Here, there would be no walls to hide them. Only open ground and whatever the White Hills had waiting for them. What waited in the yard made Asher curse under his breath. White Hill levies, lines of them, 50 at least, and that was before you counted the archers. "Loose," a voice bellowed. Asher's eyes snapped up. Lud White Hill stood back from the line, fat and smug even in mail, as if he were watching a hunt instead of a battle. Bows creaked. Strings thrummed. "Shield wall!" Asher shouted. He snatched up a shield from a dead High Point man that someone he'd dropped moments before and shoved his shoulder behind it. The Northmen surged in close, overlapping boards and steel into a tight shell. Beskha, who'd never carried a shield in her life, huddled behind them, blades still in her hands, eyes bright and furious. Arrows hammered into wood. The shields jolted and shuddered with each impact. Then the volley stopped. A roar rose from the other side of the yard as High Point men charged, screaming themselves hoarse and slamming into the shield wall like a wave. They needed the tread wheel. There was no fighting through this without John and the vanguard hitting the gate the moment it moved. A man lunged for Asher with his sword pointed at his ribs. Asher knocked the blade aside and drove his axe up into the man's throat. Blood sprayed warm across his knuckles. He spun. Dropped low. His sword flashed into a man's thigh, deep enough to hit bone in the leg. The soldier went down screaming, face first in the dirt. Asher finished him with a hard thrust between the shoulder blades. "Fall back!" Asher called. "To the wheel, now move!" They gave ground by steps, not by running, leaving bodies behind them. High Point men littered the ground. 2 more Northmen went down in the crush, dragged under before Asher could reach them. John made sure he did give me 10 good men, Asher thought grimly, and hated that he was counting already. When they reached the tread wheel, only 7 remained, which included Asher, Beskha, and 5 Northmen. Not enough. Not for long. Asher pointed. "You 2, on the wheel." The men hesitated only long enough to nod. "Turn it!" Asher shouted. "Get the gate moving. The rest of us keep them off." The 2 men threw themselves at the tread wheel and began to run it, boots thudding on wood. The others formed up around them. They were getting swarmed now. Beskha fought with both swords bare, cutting men down like she'd been born in blood and noise. Essos had forged her into something hard. The pits had done the rest. Asher met a charging man and buried his axe into the ribs, cleaving through leather and bone. Before the body could even fall, he drove his sword into another's belly and yanked it free, breathing hard through his teeth as the press closed in again. He heard the gates begin to creak open. So close. They only had to last a few moments more, just a few, and help would be through. He heard the gate begin to rise, iron shrieking on iron, chains grinding as the portcullis lifted a handspan at a time. Through the crisscrossed bars he could see movement beyond, shadows packed tight, steel and torchlight, the dark shapes of men pressed and waiting. Jon Snow's voice carried through the gaps, sharp and commanding, whipping them into fury. "Forrester scum!" Gryff White Hill one-eyed, smiling like he'd been waiting for this, pushed through the press to face Asher head-on. Another White Hill man rushed Asher from the side. Asher sidestepped, opened the man's belly with a single cut, then buried his axe in the back of his neck as he passed. He didn't even watch the body fall. Gryff was on him. Steel flashed. Asher barely got his sword up in time, the parry ringing through his arms. He answered with a headbutt that cracked Gryff across the nose. Gryff stumbled back, blood streaming down his face. "I'm going to enjoy killing you," Gryff hissed, voice thick with spite. "And the rest of your family. You hear me? After this, I'll behead your brother Ian, have him on his knees begging like a Forrester should." Asher slashed at Gryff's face. Gryff jerked his blade up, caught off guard by the speed of it. Asher followed with the axe, snapping it down at Gryff's hands. Gryff hopped back and the hatchet bit only air, but that retreat broke the bind between their swords. The instant their blades parted, Asher slid his edge down in one smooth motion, cutting Gryff from forehead to chin. A thin red line appeared, then widened. Gryff screamed, half rage, half pain. "You fucking prick." Asher lifted his sword and took Gryff's head clean off. It dropped into the mud with a wet thud, and the body followed a heartbeat later, swaying once before it collapsed. Jon and the rest of the North came streaming into the castle. Ludd was frantic now, fear plain on his face as his men were suddenly outnumbered and the margin only grew with every heartbeat as more Whitehills were cut down. Asher spotted a Whitehill man about to drive his blade into a Northman on the ground. He closed the distance in 2 strides, drove a hard punch into the man's face with his sword hand, then drew his blade back and opened the man's throat in one clean cut. The Northman looked up at him, nodded once, and scrambled to his feet. Asher turned and caught sight of Jon's nose. For a moment it nearly stole his breath. Silently, he thanked the old gods that Snow stood with them. Jon's blade was a blur. At times Asher would have sworn the point never moved at all, if not for the men in front of him dropping like flies all the same. It was the most efficient swordwork Asher had ever seen. A flicker in the corner of his eye was Beskha's steel. She cut down a man charging Asher before he could even turn. "Pay attention, West AOC," Beskha snapped. Asher gave her a quick nod, a half apology, half appreciation, and forced his eyes back to the fight. Asher ran into the keep itself. His goal now was to find Gwyn and his brother, Rian. Half of him feared Rian would be butchered in the chaos when the gates went up. He could only hope the boy had made it this far, because if he had, Asher needed to reach him before any Whitehill got a bright idea. "Damn you, bastard. I'll run you through myself." Asher heard Ludd Whitehill screaming and couldn't help but glance back. Ludd charged Jon with his sword and swung at Jon's side. Jon met the blow without effort, stepped aside, and took Ludd's head in the space of a heartbeat. Asher stared for a moment, stunned, then forced himself to move. He turned and ran up the keep's stairs. Behind him, Ludd's body lay sprawled on the stone, headless and already forgotten. "Rian! Gwyn!" Asher shouted. A guard lunged at him, blade aimed for his belly. Asher knocked it aside with the back of his sword, drove his own point forward, and buried it in the man's chest. The guard dropped without another sound. 2 doors waited ahead in the corridor. Asher threw open the first on the right. It was empty. Just a bedchamber, cold and abandoned. He crossed to the door at the end of the hall and shoved it open. Gwyn stood inside, Rian tucked behind her, both of them pale and wide-eyed. For a heartbeat Asher couldn't breathe. Then he was moving, crossing the room in 2 strides and pulling them into his arms. "Thank the old gods," he whispered, gripping them hard. "You're safe." Rian's arms only reached Asher's thighs. Gwyn's head pressed into Asher's chest as she broke into sobs. "My father," she croaked. "My brothers." Asher knew what she was really asking. "Ludd and Gryff are gone," he said softly. The truth was he'd wanted them dead. Yet he still felt a stab of pity for Gwyn. Whatever her family had done, they were still her blood. "Torren?" Gwyn asked, voice cracking. "I don't know," Asher admitted. "I haven't seen him." He bent and hugged Rian again, tighter this time. "Thank the gods you lived." "I want to go home," Rian muttered, crying now that he was finally with family. "You will," Asher promised. "Roderick and Talia will be glad to see you." Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Asher's hand went to his axe. He drew it free and lifted his sword again, planting himself between the door and the 2 of them. The Whitehills might still have men left with stupid ideas, or Northmen might decide to take their rage out on the wrong person. If either happened, Asher would stop it. The door creaked open. Jon Snow filled the doorway, face streaked with grime and blood, eyes steady. "Asher," Jon said. "You conducted yourself well on the battlefield. I'll make sure my brother hears of it." Then Jon's gaze shifted to the pair behind Asher. "Gwyn Whitehill, I take it," he said. "And who is this?" Gwyn nodded once, barely able to speak. "He's my little brother," Asher said. "Rian. The White Hills took him as a ward so my house wouldn't strike back. Gwyn kept him safe." He swallowed. "If it pleases you, my lord, I'd ask leave to send him home to Ironrath with Beskar and a few swords to guard him." Jon said. "Permission granted." His eyes returned to Gwyn. "That leaves you." Jon's voice stayed even, but the edge was there. "Your house raised arms against mine. Oathbreakers. Your kin brought hardship and death to a loyal house." Gwyn flinched as if struck. "It cannot go unpunished," Jon continued. "But I see the position you were forced into and I commend you for saving lives today. Without your knowledge, many more men would have died." He took a breath, then made the decision like a man used to giving orders. "I am acting in my brother's stead until the North is reunited. I will send a raven to rob the king in the North and of the Trident with all that has happened. Until word returns, Gwyn, you will remain in this castle as its regent." Gywyn nodded. Asher could hear men cheering. Umbers, Black Pines, Edgewoods, and the Glovers were all celebrating. They finally struck back against the traitors and scored a victory. Jon led them back down with Gwyn and Rian close behind. When they reached the yard, Asher stopped short. 57 men were lined up on their knees, hands bound, with Northmen standing behind them, swords drawn, faces hard. These men were the ones that surrendered. Jon stepped forward and raised his voice so every man could hear. "Every man here who bore steel against the king in the North is a traitor." Jon's gaze swept the line. "But the king has offered mercy. Take the black, and you will be spared the headsman's sword." He paused, letting it sink in. "Those who choose the wall, rise. Step forward." All but 2 men stayed kneeling. Asher's eyes went to the ones who stood, and he saw Gwyn move at once, rushing to Torren where he stood among the spared. "Why did you do it?" Torren demanded, venom in every word as he glared at her. "Why, Gwyn? What you were doing was evil," Gwyn snapped back, shaking with anger, and hurt, deeper than anger. "No matter how I pleaded with you, father, or Gryff, none of you would listen. Father was going to murder Rian, he's but a boy. And you wanted him to do it." Torren's mouth twisted. "You're a kinslayer, Gwyn. I want nothing to do with you." Jon heard him. "And you," Jon said coldly, "are an oathbreaker." He turned to Galbart Glover. "Escort these traitors to the wall," Jon ordered. "We'll see if their lives still have any use left in them." Galbart nodded once. Jon's eyes returned to the 2 men still kneeling. One was the master-at-arms of House Whitehill, hard-eyed, and defiant. The other was only a swordsman, no one important, but stubborn enough to refuse the wall all the same. Jon gave them their last words. Then he took their heads. Chapter 9, Awakening and Revenge. Chapter text. Oliver POV. Oliver groaned as pain lanced through his stomach, sharp as a hot knife. He tried to open his eyes, but the sun's rays hit him so hard he had to squint until the room stopped swimming. His lips were dry, his mouth weak, and dizziness rolled through him in waves. "Oliver," an angelic voice called. He blinked at the shadow in the light until it took shape. "Myra." "Thirsty?" Oliver rasped, barely forcing the word out. Myra snatched up a cup, poured water, and brought it to his lips. His hand rose and brushed hers before he managed to grip the cup and drink like a man who had been stranded at sea. "Thank the gods you're awake. I feared you." Myra trailed off, tears gathering in her eyes. With water finally easing his throat, he could speak again. "By the pain I'm feeling, I'd guess I'm still alive," Oliver muttered. The words were as much for him as for her. "Yes, you bloody fool. You made it," Myra snapped, then took the cup, refilled it, and set it on the table beside his bed. "How long was I out?" he asked. "A little over a day," she said. Silence settled between them, heavy and unavoidable. "Oliver," Myra began, voice tightening, "before you passed out, we need to talk about what you said." He swallowed, his throat still raw. "Myra. I thought I was dying. Think of it as nothing more than a drunk man's words. You don't get to turn away from it. Not after what we've been through," Myra shot back. Oliver's eyes flicked away. His pride wanted to flee. His body would not let him. "I know I'll never be good enough," he said, quiet and bitter. "I've tried to accept it. But when I thought the stranger had me, I couldn't keep it inside." Myra's expression tightened, and not with anger alone. "Do you understand the position you've put me in?" she asked. "I don't follow," Oliver croaked. "Of course you don't, you foolish gold cloak," Myra said, the teeth thin and sharp, used like a shield. She took a breath and forced the words out, each one carefully chosen. "I loved my father. I love my brothers. They love me too. But being a lady of a house is a responsibility we can't shy away from. We don't get the luxury of choosing who we are with. Our duty is to our family. To alliances. To keeping our house standing when the world tries to tear it down." Oliver frowned. "I would never ask you to throw that aside." "But you already have," Myra said, and her voice softened in a way that made it hurt more. "Because now, no matter who I'm promised to, how can he compete with the man who fought to pull me back from death? How can I pretend it means nothing?" Before he could answer, she leaned down and kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was the kind of kiss you give when you have already decided you will regret it. Their tongues exploring each other's mouths. She pulled back only when she had to breathe. "For my family," she said, barely above a whisper, "that will be the last time we allow ourselves to let go." Then she kissed his forehead, lingering for a heartbeat, and stepped away. Oliver watched her go, too weak to reach for her, too proud to call her back, and too hurt to do either. The door closed behind her, and the room felt colder than it had a moment before. Oliver took a few more gulps, downing the water quickly before throwing it across the room and slamming it against the wall in frustration. He knew this is what was to be expected, and while he was thrilled he finally kissed her, it was heartbreak that was winning through. Gerald POV. If a man slipped through the first checkpoint, if a captain took a bribe, if fog and rain and night hid the wrong boat on the wrong water, then this was where it would be caught. A second line. An emergency line. Gerald had nodded when the king told him, like the order did not change the shape of his life. Now he sat his horse on the bank and stared at what he had been given. The river moved cold and steady between the trees, and the checkpoint squatted beside it, half-built and already watching. A rough gate across the road. Stakes driven into wet ground. A watchfire laid out but not yet lit. Men in cloaks with bows slung over their shoulders, pretending not to look at him while they looked at him all the same. His command. Not the first barrier, the proud one where the lords would come and see the work and praise themselves for it. This one was quieter. Hidden by design. The place you only noticed when something had already gone wrong. Gerald felt his throat tighten. He had fought for Robb. He had bled for him. He had stood in the press of men with steel swinging and death close enough to breathe. None of that felt like this. A veteran stepped forward, older than Gerald by years and confidence both. His eyes flicked over Gerald's cloak, his sword, the newness of him. "Sir Gerald," the man said. Hearing it out loud made Gerald's stomach twist. He forced his hands to still on the reins. "How many men?" Gerald asked, because he needed something solid to hold on to. 20 here, the veteran replied. Another 20 across the water. 2 riders ready to run messages to the first checkpoint. Gerald nodded, as if he understood it all. He did not. He looked at the river again and imagined a boat slipping past the first line in the dark. He imagined Robb's face when the news reached him. Gerald swallowed. "All right," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Show me where you've set the eyes and where you've set the teeth." The man started to point it out. Riverboats were out in force, moored with ropes to stakes driven into the bank so the current could not carry them off. Archers were posted on both sides of the river, most of them hidden in brush and reeds. Any boat that came through was to be stopped, inspected, and searched. Robb wanted the twins to starve until they were forced to sally out. Gerald was here to make sure it happened. The water itself was calm. No frothing rapids, no violent rush, only a steady stream and small ripples sliding past the hulls. It almost made the work feel unreal, as if the river did not understand what it had become. Upstream, at the first checkpoint, the phrase had already tried to run men and supplies through. Some were turned back. Many were cut down, and others were dropped by arrows before they could reach the bank. Rob had no interest in diplomacy or mercy for this lot. Only retribution. Gerald would have protested, once. He would have argued for prisoners, for questions, for some measured hand. But then he thought of Jonelle, and how he would have reacted if it had been her at the twins, her on her knees, her blood on their boards. Those who knew Gerald best called him soft-hearted. It was true, most days. Yet when it came to the people he loved, something darker lived in him, waiting. He was not above letting that rage take him. He could imagine it, clear as if it were in front of him. He could imagine taking Walder Free by the throat and tearing him apart like some great ice spider of the far north. Gerald crouched and let his mind drift to Jonelle instead. He missed her more than he wanted to admit. Her brown hair falling down her back. Her brown eyes that could look straight through him. If he could tell her he'd been knighted, she would smack him on the head, call him a liar, and tell him to shut up and eat his dinner. A small laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Gerald's laugh died the moment the shout went up. Boat. He straightened so fast his knee cracked against a stone. The river had been calm all morning, a steady stream with small ripples that made it easy to forget what it was now. Not water, not travel, not life. A weapon. Men moved at once, quiet and practiced. Boots sank into the wet bank. Cloaks brushed against reeds. Bowstrings tightened without a word. The veteran sergeant, the one Rob's riders had left with Gerald, appeared at his shoulder as if he had been there the whole time. Mists rolling in, the sergeant murmured. Hard to see upstream. Gerald looked out over the water. A thin fog crawled low, turning distance into a blur and hiding the far bank behind pale grey. Across the river, their second checkpoint watched from the shadows, two archers tucked into brush with their faces smeared dark. A signal lantern sat covered, ready but unlit. Gerald forced a slow breath through his nose. He knew this command was his. Rob had said it plainly. The second net. The emergency line. If anything slipped past the first checkpoint, it would be caught here or the whole plan would rot. He had nodded when the king told him, like it was nothing. Now his mouth was dry. What did the watchers see? He asked. Sound of oars, the sergeant said. No light. Gerald crouched behind a clump of brush at the water's edge and peered through reeds that smelled of mud and cold. For a moment there was only the whisper of the current and the creak of ropes where their riverboats were moored to stakes driven into the bank. Rob's boats were out in force. Ropes ran from hull to shore to keep them from being pushed downriver. It looked almost peaceful if a man did not know better. Then Gerald heard it. A steady rhythm, faint but controlled. Oars. Not a fisherman's lazy pull, not a raft carried by current. A crew that knew the river and wanted to be unseen. Gerald lifted his hand and held it still, 2 fingers raised. The sergeant repeated the sign down the line. Somewhere across the water, a hidden man would see it and mirror it. No one spoke. Every man waited on Gerald now, and the knowledge sat heavy on his shoulders. A darker shape slid into the fog upstream, low in the water. A narrow craft, built to hug the bank and vanish into reeds. It drifted closer, careful as a thief. Gerald tracked it by sound more than sight, letting it come into the space where he could judge the weight and the intent. The boat rode heavy. Food, he thought. Or men. Rob wanted the twins to starve until they were forced to rally out. There would be no mercy. No negotiations. No trading and pleading and delays. The phrase had murdered under guest right and paid for it with every breath they took afterward. Gerald had not argued with Rob. Not after the Red Wedding. He had seen friends die. Men he had eaten with, men he had laughed with, men who had been alive one heartbeat and dead the next. He had watched steel flash in a hole that should have been safe. He had watched Rob's face change into something he did not recognize, and in the days after, Gerald had felt his own heart grow harder as if it were being packed with ice. The boat slipped closer. Gerald saw hunched shapes inside it, cloaks drawn tight. He watched for a lantern. None. A hand dipped low and kept something steady in the belly of the craft. A blade, he thought. A sack of grain. A barrel of salt fish. He kept his hand raised, waiting for the moment when a single decision would matter more than any speech. The boat angled toward their bank, trying to slip past the place the first barrier would have been if this were the first checkpoint. Clever. Quiet. Counting on fog and fatigue and the confidence that Rob's men would not be thorough. Gerald lowered his hand, then lifted it again in one sharp motion. Loose. Arrows hissed out of the reeds on both banks. The first volley struck wood and flesh. A man in the boat jerked backward and toppled over the side without a sound. Another cried out, high and sharp, then collapsed forward over the oar bench. The boat veered, scraping against a moored hull, caught by current and rope. Someone in the craft tried to stand and cut free. A second volley slammed into the boat's side, and the man fell back, clutching his shoulder. Hooks, the sergeant barked. Men surged forward with poles and iron hooks, snagging the slipping craft and dragging it in. The fog muffled the noise, but the fighting did not stay quiet for long. Steel rang. A man screamed. Someone cursed the phrase by name. Gerald's pulse hammered in his ears. Second boat, a watcher shouted. Gerald turned, and his stomach dropped. A larger craft emerged from the mist, higher in the water and moving faster, heading straight for the bank. It spoke out through the ripples like a knife. It meant to land men while the first boat held their attention. A diversion. Gerald felt the fear twist into something hard and clean. Archers on that boat, he ordered. Now. Arrows flew again. The second craft rocked as shafts struck its side. One man stumbled. Another dropped to a knee. Still it came on, and Gerald realized it had more men than he wanted to face on wet ground. They'll make the bank, someone shouted. Gerald drew his sword. His hands did not shake now. The fear was still there, but it had changed. It was focus. It was the simple truth that if he failed here, Rob's plan would fail with him, and the twins would last longer. Longer meant more free men alive. Longer meant the stain of that hole lingering in the world. Spears with me, Gerald said. Shield line. Men formed up at the water's edge, boots slipping in mud. Shields came together. Spears angled out. Gerald took the center without thinking. If he asked men to stand, then he stood with them. The second boat scraped into the bank. Boots splashed into shallow water. Free men jumped down, swords out, faces set with the confidence of men who thought they were slipping through a gap. He thought of Jonelle. Not the soft memory of her laugh, but the thought of her on her knees like Talisa had been, like so many had been, helpless while men with knives decided her worth. The image was so sharp it made Gerald's vision narrow. A free lunged. Gerald met him. Steel rang out. The first blow jolted up Gerald's arm. The second he turned aside with his shield. He stepped in close, too close for fancy sword work, and drove his blade into the man's ribs. The free's shouts died in a wet gasp. He fell into the shallow water, and the river took his blood in thin ribbons that slid away as if nothing had happened. Gerald did not watch him sink. There was no time. The shoreline became chaos. Men shouted. Spears thrust. Shields slammed. Arrows thudded into bodies at close range when there was no room for careful aim. Mud grabbed at boots like hands. A man slipped and went down with a cry, and another dragged him back by the collar before a free sword could find his throat. Hold. Gerald roared. Hold the line. The word came out like a command he had never known he could give. Men answered it. They braced. They shoved. They kept the phrase from spilling onto land. A free captain forced his way forward, heavier armor, better blade, face hard with the confidence of a man used to winning in other people's halls. He pointed his sword at Gerald. You're the one. Gerald stepped forward. The captain swung high. Gerald blocked it and felt the shock rattle his teeth. The captain swung again, and again Gerald caught it, then drove his shoulder into the man's chest. They went down together in the mud. The captain tried to bring his sword up. Gerald grabbed his wrist, twisted, and punched him hard enough that the man's head snapped back. The captain spat blood and tried to laugh through it. You'll hang for this. Gerald leaned closer, close enough to smell the man's breath. From what rope? He growled. Yours. The captain's eyes flickered. Gerald ended it without ceremony. He rose, breathing hard, mud on his knees, blood on his hands. The riverbank went quiet in the way a battlefield goes quiet when the fight has already decided its winner. A few free men tried to scramble back into the boat. Arrows took them in the back. One crawled toward the reeds, dragging himself with broken hands. Gerald turned his head and saw the first craft too. It had been hauled in and pinned against the moored line. Men were pulling bodies out of it and cursing as they did, stripping blades, checking pockets. A Northman shouted, "They've got food." Gerald climbed onto the nearest hull and looked into the belly of the boat. Sacks spilled in a heap beneath a canvas sheet, grain and hard bread and salt fish wrapped in cloth. Enough to keep men alive behind stone. Enough to make the twins last longer. The sight made Gerald's stomach tighten. This was what starvation looked like from the other side. Not poetry. Not banners. Just food meant for traitors, and men dead in mud so it would not reach them. The sergeant appeared beside him, breathing hard. "Orders, sir." Gerald looked down at the water, then downriver toward where the twins sat unseen. He imagined Walder Free eating by a warm hearth while the river folk shivered. He imagined free men laughing behind walls. He thought of Rob's face after the wedding. Grief turned into something colder. He thought of his own heart hardening to match it. "Not a crumb goes to the twins," Gerald said. The sergeant nodded as if he had expected nothing else. "And the food?" "Count it." "Guard it," Gerald replied. "We feed our own men. The rest goes to Riverrun." The sergeant's eyes flickered with approval, quick and gone. "A good answer. A steady answer." A wounded free groaned near the bank. Gerald turned and saw him, half in mud, half in water, still breathing. The man's face was pale and twisted with fear. One of Gerald's soldiers stalked toward him with an axe, eager to finish it. "Wait," Gerald said. The soldier froze and looked back. "Sir." Gerald stepped down from the hull and walked toward the free. Men watched him. They watched the way men watch a commander after the first fight, deciding what kind of man he really was. The free tried to crawl backward. His hand slipped in mud. Gerald stopped a few feet away and looked down at him. "What were you carrying?" Gerald asked. The free coughed, then rasped, "Food. For my lord." "For your traitor lord," someone spat. Gerald's jaw clenched. He could feel the heat in his chest, the same heat that had flared in the wedding hall when blades came out and the world turned upside down. He pictured Jonelle again. Her brown hair down her back. Her eyes that could look straight into his soul and see when he was lying to himself. She had no idea what had happened. She had no idea he had been knighted. She had no idea he was standing here with men waiting on his orders. He could not even write to her. Words on parchment were useless to him. He could swing a spear, he could bleed for a king, but he could not send his own wife a sentence. If it had been Jonelle instead of Talisa, if it had been Jonelle butchered in a hole while men laughed behind their cups, what would he want done to the ones who did it? The answer came too easily. Gerald's voice went flat. "Strip him." The men went still. The sergeant looked at Gerald, testing him. "Sir." "Strip him," Gerald repeated. "Tie him to the boat." The free's eyes widened, and he started to sob, begging in a voice that did not sound like a soldier anymore. Gerald did not answer him. A man muttered, uncertain, "We could hang him." Gerald turned his head, and the man swallowed the rest of the thought. Gerald did not need to shout. The look was enough. "No," Gerald said. "He lives." The sergeant's brows drew together. "Lives to do what?" Gerald stared down at the free. His hands trembled inside his gloves, so he kept them at his sides. He would not show weakness in front of men who had just fought for him. "He lives to carry a message," Gerald said. They dragged the free to the boat. Rough hands tore away his cloak and shirt. He kicked weakly, but he was exhausted and bleeding and outnumbered. They bound him tight to the planks, rope biting into wrists and ankles. The sergeant stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What message?" Gerald's throat tightened. He could taste iron. "Traitor," Gerald said. The sergeant gave a single nod and motioned to a man with a knife. Gerald did not watch closely. He did not stop it either. When it was done, the Free lay trembling, eyes squeezed shut, tears cutting clean lines through mud on his cheeks. The word sat on his forehead in ugly cuts, blood covering his face. It would be seen. It would be remembered. It would not be mistaken for anything else. Gerald stepped close enough that the Free could hear him over the river. "You go back," Gerald said quietly. "You tell them the river belongs to the king. You tell them you tried to feed traitors, and this is what you earned." The Free tried to speak. Nothing came but a whimper. Gerald straightened and looked at the boat. "Push it off," he ordered. Men shoved the craft into the current. The river took it without care, turning it slowly, carrying it downriver toward the twins. For a moment the boat spun, and the Free's face turned back toward the bank, toward Gerald, eyes wide with terror. Gerald held his gaze until the fog swallowed the boat and left only ripples behind. A runner splashed up from the far bank, breathless. "Sir Gerald." The first checkpoint signaled. "They never saw these boats slip. If you hadn't been here." Gerald nodded once. If he had not been here, those sacks would be on Free tables by nightfall. The twins would last longer. The world would forget faster. Rob's justice would soften at the edges. Gerald wiped mud from his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at his men. They were watching him still. Some with approval. Some with a new caution. All with attention. "Send word to the king," Gerald said. "Tell him the second net held." Chapter 10, Betrayal. Chapter text. Theon felt the wind cut through him, cold and salt-crusted, as he gripped the wet rail of the longship. Rob had sent him home with an offer for Balon Greyjoy. "You want freedom? Fight with us and take it." His father's answer had been a cold slap. Not only had Balon refused, he had commanded Theon to raise arms against the Starks. It was madness. The western lands lay ripe for plunder with rich coasts, fat keeps, and a treasury of gold, while the northern host was away at war. Yet Balon spoke only of raiding the north. Cold shores and impoverished villages, paid for in grain and blood, with angry swords rising for every mile they took. It made no sense. It was the strategy of a man more interested in nursing old grudges than building a future. Rob would not take these attacks lying down. He would answer them, and now that he had survived the Red Wedding, Theon shuddered to think what kind of man the young wolf would become when he heard of this betrayal. It wouldn't just be anger or grief. It would be blood. The memory of Pike came back without leave, sharp as a fish hook. "Your time with the wolves has made you weak," Balon had said, as if Theon were a boy again. "You act as if I volunteered to go." Theon had snapped back, voice rising before he could stop it. The rage had been there all along, waiting. Waiting for someone to name what he was. Waiting for permission to spill. "You gave me away, if you remember," he'd shouted. "The day you bent the knee to Robert Baratheon after he crushed you. Did he take what was yours then?" The smack had come fast and hard, the sound of it louder than the surf. For a heartbeat, the world had tilted. "You gave me away," Theon had said again, breath shaking. "Your boy. Your last boy. Like I was some dog you didn't want anymore. And now you curse me because I come home." Balon had not answered. He had not even looked at him. He had only turned and walked out, leaving Theon's words hanging in the air like smoke. Theon blinked, forcing himself back into the present. His stomach was in knots, twisting tighter with every creak of timber and slap of a wave. He was being asked to betray a man he loved like a brother for a father who barely saw him as a person. He drew in a deep breath. Salt filled his lungs, but it brought no calm. He watched the men moving along the deck, checking lines, hauling gear, laughing like wolves that had already tasted blood. They were eager. They were ready. Theon's fingers tightened on the rail. He could not let this happen. He might be a Greyjoy by name, but Rob, Bran, and Rickon were the only family he had left. The ship carried barely 20 men. It was a paltry force, yet Theon had convinced them they could take Winterfell if they struck fast and bold. While Asher sailed for Deepwood Motte to bleed the Glovers and carry off whatever the western coast had left unguarded, Theon had argued until his throat went raw. Deepwood would be a waste of blood. The Glovers were not Lannisters, there was no gold behind those walls, only stubborn men, hard winters, and shallow graves. Balon had only spat at his feet, reaffirming his plans with a grunt. It was proud, stubborn madness. Theon's problem was simple: how could he stop them? Winterfell was a long ride inland, and he needed to reach it regardless. That was why he'd fed his crew the dream of the Great Keep. He'd watched their eyes light up at the thought of such a prize. He liked to fancy himself the finest archer in Westeros, but even he knew he couldn't lose 20 men off a deck by himself. He had to thin the pack first. They slipped into a lonely, forgotten dock with no one in sight. Theon breathed a quiet thanks to the drowned god as the hull scraped wood and went still. The men jumped out to tie the boat off, restless and eager to be on solid ground. Theon kept his face a mask of cool command. Through the woods he told them, gesturing toward the dark tree line of the Wolf's Wood. We trek through the forest and take Winterfell from the shadows. They nodded, already talking about the castle as if it were a purse waiting to be cut. But a problem emerged before the first mile was behind them: they lacked the rations for a sustained march. The ride inland was grueling, and they had brought only what they could carry. Hunger would make them careless, and careless men were loud. Theon realized this was his opening. "We need game," Theon said aloud, pitching his voice to Carrie. "We'll be eating our own boots by tomorrow night if we don't find meat." One of the Reavers grunted, rubbing a hand over his belly. "I can feel my stomach gnawing at me already." "Let me see what I can find," Theon suggested, his tone casual. "I know these woods. I've hunted them since I was a boy." He was pleasantly surprised when they took the bait. "Go on then, get us some dinner, ya wolf's pup," one of the men responded, the insult intended to remind Theon that despite his blood, he was still an outsider to them. Theon gritted his teeth, the frustration burning hot in his chest. He had dealt with these small slights time and again since returning to the islands. He was ready to make them pay, but not with words, but with steel. Theon glared at the man, memorizing his face, then turned and walked away. He vanished into the deep shadows of the forest, his bow gripped tight in his hand and his quiver heavy against his back. He wasn't hunting deer. He was hunting them. The first man Theon had picked off was a man in his late 40s by the name of Gilly. He was of slightly above average height but a belly rounded by his frequent ale use. Gilly himself loved to boast of the times of his raidings, him forcing himself on any girl that he came across from most of the Seven Kingdoms. From ages as old as 60 name days, to some younger than any reasonable man could stomach. He had left the group to take a piss, and it was the last thing he had ever done. Theon didn't regret loosing an arrow into his throat. Theon felt the rough branches of the ironwoods brush against his cheeks as he ghosted through the undergrowth. He moved with a silence that would have made a shadow jealous. Every few minutes, he would stop, draw his bow, and let a single arrow fly. He didn't care if they tracked the shafts back to the source. By the time the arrow found its mark, Theon was already gone, melting back into the grey mist of the forest. 1, 2, 3. He paced himself, keeping his breath steady and his heart rate low. He loosed again. The shaft struck a boy on his first raid, which was a lad who couldn't have been more than 14. Theon felt a sharp twinge of regret as he watched the boy crumple, a fleeting memory of Rukon flashing through his mind. But he buried the feeling as quickly as it came. In the Wolf's Wood, there was no room for mercy, only survival. He slipped around the flank of the group, circling through a thicket of briars that would have shredded a sailor's skin. From his new vantage point behind them, he loosed another. The man dropped without a sound. The Ironborn were starting to crack. They huddled together, their eyes darting wildly toward the trees. Spread out, a veteran named Donal roared, his hand white-knuckled on his axe. "I think our wolf pup is showing us he has fangs. Let's show him that the men of Pike fear no wolf. We'll take his head and give his body to the drowned god." Donal's bravado rang hollow in the cold air. Theon watched them from the shadows, already reaching for his next arrow. They could shout at the drowned god all they liked. Out here, the drowned god was with Theon, and he wanted these men dead. Another arrow leapt from Theon's bow, piercing a man squarely in the face. The 15 men remaining caught a glimpse of his shadow and let fly a volley of their own. Theon didn't wait to see where they landed. He dodged and weaved into the deep woods, the sound of iron-borne shafts thudding into ancient trees echoing behind him as he ran. He skidded to a halt, pivoted, and fired once more. The arrow took a reaver in the chest just as the man burst through the brush, dropping him mid-stride. 14, Theon noted mentally. The pack was hot on his trail, shouting and crashing through the undergrowth, but Theon held every advantage. These were the woods where he, Robb, and Jon had played as boys. He remembered the long afternoons spent sparring with Robb against Jon, and the endless hunts that had sharpened his eye. He knew the dip of every ravine and the bend of every stream better than he knew the cold stone holes of Pike. He would make them pay for every inch of stark land they stepped on. Leaping across a narrow, rushing stream, he landed softly and turned in one fluid motion. As soon as the first of them appeared through the tree line, he loosed. The shaft struck the man in the eye, dropping him dead on the spot. "I'm going to tear you limb from limb, you damn traitor!" Donal's scream ripped through the forest. The word stung, a sharp jab to an old wound. He was a traitor to the Kraken, but in his heart, he knew they had abandoned him long ago. His own flesh and blood had traded him away like a common hound. As he reached for another arrow, he made a silent vow, he would remain loyal to the family that had actually claimed him. An arrow whizzed past, grazing the skin just below Theon's right shoulder. The sting was sharp and hot, but he turned on instinct, loosing 2 shafts in quick succession. 2 more men dropped into the muck. The drowned god would be pleased, he thought, but there was no time for prayer. He had to move. He had to reach Winterfell. Theon remembered a waterfall nearby, a small cascade spilling over a rocky crevice, no taller than 2 men standing on each other's shoulders. He scrambled behind the curtain of water and into a narrow cave, his chest heaving. His sides ached with every shallow, desperate gasp, but the roar of the falls offered a momentary reprieve from the shouting of the hunt. He pressed his back against the cold, damp stone, listening. He could hear the Ironborn just outside, their heavy boots splashing through the stream as they searched for his trail. If they bypassed the falls, he was safe; if they entered, he was cornered. The cave went deep enough that he could retreat into the dark, but he knew his best chance was to pick them off as they crossed the threshold. A shadow flickered against the light of the waterfall as a man stepped inside. Before the Reaver could utter a word of warning, Theon's arrow pierced his neck. It missed the jugular by a fraction, but the torrent of blood pouring down the man's tunic made the outcome certain. He slumped silently into the spray. Theon readied another shaft instantly. As a second man followed, he loosed, the arrow slamming into the man's chest and throwing him back into the water. Through the crashing white noise of the falls, Theon saw a third shadow looming. He didn't hesitate. The third arrow struck the man squarely in the head, dropping him instantly where he stood. 9 more, Theon thought, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He reached back into his quiver, his fingers brushing against the fletching. He took a moment to count by touch, 7. Not enough. Theon had never been a great swordsman. He was a step behind Robb, and a hell of a lot worse than Jon. At their best, Jon could almost take them both on at once. Still, the weight of the sword at his side was all he had left. He could feel his nerves fraying, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Retreating deeper into the darkness of the cave, he listened as the Ironborn split up to search the crevices. He offered a silent thanks to the drowned god, splitting their strength meant he might actually survive the hour. A man peered around a jagged corner of stone. Theon didn't hesitate. He loosed, the arrow punching through the man's eye with such force the tip emerged from the back of his skull, the shaft wedging firmly in the bone. 3 more men charged at the sound of the body hitting the floor. Taking quick backward steps, Theon fired as fast as he could draw. 3 arrows, 3 chests. They dropped instantly. The screams of the dying echoed through the stone halls, alerting the second group. Theon scrambled to a fallen body, wrenching a blooded arrow free and shoving it back into his quiver. He didn't have time to scavenge a second as the remaining men rounded the bend. He remembered joking with Robb about entering archery competitions. He'd boasted that he could win a small fortune that was enough to keep them in ale and brothels for a year. Robb would laugh and join him at the alehouses, but Theon could never convince his brother to follow him into the brothels. Now, that confidence was being put to the ultimate test. He fired again, striking another man in the face, then ducked behind a pillar of rock as iron-borne arrows shattered against the stone. He pivoted, caught another man in his sights, and dropped him before retreating further into the gloom. The cave trail was narrowing and the end was near. Theon knew he had to finish this here, or he would never see Winterfell again. "You have nowhere left to run, pup. I'm going to string you up." Donal's voice echoed through the damp stone corridors, jagged with fury. Theon's response was silent and lethal. He pivoted around the corner, loosed a shaft, and watched the man standing at Donal's shoulder crumple with an arrow in his throat. "It's just you two left," Theon taunted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline singing in his blood. "You call yourselves Seaborn Reavers? Pathetic." Donal snarled, gripping his one-handed axe and holding it out like a challenge. "Then fight me like a man, you coward. Or are you only fit for striking from the darkness like some wench ripe for the taking?" Theon didn't let the insult goad him into a mistake. He reached back, his fingers closing around the cold fletching of his very last arrow. He drew the string, took a breath of the cave's stale air, and peeked around the corner once more. The shaft flew true, nailing the second man squarely in the chest. Only Donal remained. Donal was a man in his early 30s, a veteran of a dozen raids and a man Balon had specifically planted on this boat to watch his son. Theon was sure of it, he was the eyes of the Iron Islands, a constant reminder that Theon was never truly trusted. Now, the bow was empty. Theon dropped it, the wood clattering against the stone, and drew his sword. He would make sure the drowned god received a worthy sacrifice today and he would pay the iron price in Donal's blood. Theon charged, his blade whistling through the damp air as he slashed at Donal. The older man stepped back with practiced ease, swinging his heavy axe in a counter-arc that forced Theon to jerk away. He felt the cold wind of the blade breeze against his face, a hair's breadth from death. Theon retreated a few steps, bracing himself against the slick stone. Donal stood his ground, eyes narrowed, waiting for the pup to overextend. Theon didn't make him wait long. He lunged with a sudden downward strike. Donal twisted to shield himself, but the stark steel bit through his leather armor. It was a shallow hit, barely grazing the skin, but it drew the first blood. On pure instinct, Donal swung his axe sideways. The heavy iron head slammed into the steel plate covering Theon's chest with a deafening crack. The blow knocked the wind from Theon's lungs, sending him stumbling back into the dark. Seeing his opening, Donal raised his axe high for a downward executioner's strike aimed straight for Theon's head. In a fraction of a second, Theon did the only thing he could. Instead of retreating, he stepped in close, inside the arc of the axe, and stabbed hard. The blade tore through Donal's leather jerkin and deep into his gut. The older man gasped, his eyes bulging as dark blood began to pour over the steel. In a final, desperate surge of strength, Donal tried to bring his axe around one last time. Theon caught the man's wrist, holding him steady and staring him directly in the eyes as the light began to fade. "You betrayed your family, your people," Donal choked out, a red foam flecking his lips. "Why?" "I didn't betray my family," Donal, Theon said, his voice cold and certain. "Balon made it clear I'm no son of his. My real father lost his head in King's Landing, and you wanted to attack my brother. My real family." As the words left his lips, Donal's eyes went cold, and his body went slack. The drowned god had claimed his sacrifice. Theon let Donal go, the body sliding into the cold cave water with a final splash. He traced his fingers over his chest plate, the dent was deep and sharp, the steel bending painfully into his ribs. He winced. Sir Roderick would have given him a legendary thrashing for a fight that sloppy. He could almost hear the old master-at-arms growling that he should have been dead 10 times over. Still, he had won. He was alive, and he had a purpose. A few hours later, the silhouette of Winterfell rose out of the mist. To his shock, a massive host surrounded the castle, at least 10,000 strong, a forest of spears and flickering campfires. "Halt! Who goes there?" a guard shouted. Theon squinted at the battlements. "Morgan." The man-at-arms leaned over the stone, blinking in surprise. "Theon. You picked a hell of a time to return. Who is in charge here?" Theon called out, his voice raspy from the trek. "Jon Snow," Morgan explained as the winch began to groan. "He's back from the wall, released of his vows." Theon nodded, a strange mix of relief and anxiety bubbling up. Bring me to him. I need to speak with him immediately. The gates swung open, and it wasn't long before he was standing in the great hall, face to face with Jon. Jon looked different, harder, more solemn. He stared at Theon as if he were a ghost. Theon. What are you doing here? Jon's voice was like ice. You were supposed to bring us ships. The ships came, Jon Theon explained, swaying on his feet. But they are sailing for Deepwood Motte. 1,000 strong. My father plans to take the coast. You betrayed us. Jon snapped, stepping forward, his hand moving toward his hilt. They had never